Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We now begin with Story 1, The House of Life Scribes and Secrets of Ancient Thoth. You are in Egypt. Not the Egypt of pyramids or tourists, but the Egypt of ink, of reed pens, of scribes whose names have been lost to time. The air smells of ink made from soot, of leather bindings, of sweat dried on linen tunics. You are inside a Ankh, a house of life, not a building of medicine or miracle, but a quiet fortress of words. The world of the Ankh. The term Ankh, which means house of life, refers not to a place of healing as modern readers might imagine, but to institutions attached to temples, especially during the New Kingdom and later. These were part library, part scriptorium, and part school. The ancient Egyptians believed words had magical potency, and the written word was not merely a record, it was an act of creation. To write was to bring into being. This belief made the act of inscription sacred, and those who did it were not mere administrators. They were craftspeople of reality, apprentices in a tradition said to originate from the god Thoth himself, the ibis-headed deity of writing, wisdom, and measurement. In these houses of life, scribes trained for years to master hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts, complex systems requiring not just memorization, but a deep understanding of grammar, numerology, and symbolism. The student began as a copyist, repeating religious hymns, spells, and temple records. The hours were long. Errors could cost a young scribe their position or worse, bring down a curse, as some believed. But the rewards were immense. Scribes, though rarely wealthy, were part of the educated elite. They served in temples, royal courts, and administrative posts. They were not just passive recorders. They interpreted, commented, and sometimes altered texts as they copied. The written legacy of Egypt, what we have found in tombs, temples, and rubbish heaps, comes from their calloused hands and weary eyes. The practical power of words. The Ankh was also a center of utility. Egyptians used written documents for everything: land surveys, medical texts, magical incantations, bookkeeping, and complex theological discourses. One might find a papyrus containing instructions on how to appease a rebellious spirit, next to a manual for treating eye infections with honey and natron. There was no firm separation between the rational and the magical. Everything written had power. Spells were written to protect homes, to help women conceive, to ensure safe travel in the underworld. Even personal letters sometimes included small invocations or protective charms. The material act of writing could bridge worlds, the living and the dead, the divine and the human. A scribe working by oil lamp in a Ankh might copy the Book of the Dead, muttering the words aloud not just to transcribe them, but to keep them alive. The breath carried the spell. This was not superstition to them, it was method, part of an ontological system in which writing was action. The myth of Thoth and the gift of writing. According to Egyptian myth, Thoth invented writing, MDW in letter 1E6FR, divine speech, as a gift to humanity. He was said to have authored countless books. Some sources claim over 36,000 scrolls, and stored them in the House of Life. Thoth was the cosmic balance keeper, the measurer of time, the scribe who recorded the judgment of the soul in the Hall of Mad. But in one version of the tale, preserved centuries later by Greek writers, Thoth's gift was double-edged. In Plato's Phaedrus, an Egyptian king named Thammus warns that writing will not bring wisdom, but only the appearance of it. Memory will weaken, and people will rely on external marks rather than inner understanding. The paradox was apparent even in antiquity. Writing preserves knowledge, but it also detaches it from the living body. It externalizes, distances. Was the scribe a conduit for wisdom or a wall between thought and truth? This tension lingered in Egyptian thought and later echoed in Hermetic traditions of late antiquity and the Middle Ages. What is preserved is not always what was intended. Papyrus preservation and the fragility of memory. The materials of the scribe were both powerful and delicate. Papyrus, made from the pith of the papyrus plant, was durable in Egypt's dry climate but fragile elsewhere. Much of what survived was buried in tombs, dry garbage dumps, or sealed temple storerooms. Scribes used reed pens, sharpened carefully, and dipped in carbon ink made from soot and gum Arabic. Colors were symbolic: black for normal text, red for headings or magical words of power. A red name could summon a demon or drive it away. Scrolls were not books in our modern sense, and most were anonymous. Even grand works like the Book of the Dead were copied with personalization in mind: names changed, spells adapted, illustrations modified. There was no fixed canon. Many scrolls were lost, reused, or buried. The House of Life preserved knowledge, but it also let much slip through its fingers. Fires, conquests, floods, and disinterest each played their part. What we have today is a fraction of what once existed. The rest lies unread in sand and silence. Who were the scribes? The average scribe did not write philosophy. He copied hymns, measured grain, or calculated taxes. But through this work, the scribes kept the engine of civilization running. They were middlemen between kings and farmers, between gods and people. They translated divine will into law and material abundance into records. Many were attached to temples, but others worked in royal or commercial offices. Some became powerful, like the famous Thoth, who wrote ethical treatises. Others remained nameless, known only by the handwriting on a tomb wall or a marginal note on a papyrus. Training was grueling. A famous inscription found in a scribe school mockingly tells students to abandon physical labor and embrace the scribe's life. Be a scribe, it saves you from toil. You will become great through it. But the life was far from easy. The apprentice was beaten for mistakes, sat for hours in unshaded courtyards, and repeated the same formulas endlessly. Still, in a society where literacy was rare, the scribe had power. Quiet, subtle power, but real. The mysterious Book of Thoth. Later Egyptian traditions, especially during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, spoke of a legendary Book of Thoth, said to contain spells that could let one speak with animals, raise the dead, or behold the gods. This book, likely mythical, would come to fascinate Greek and Roman occultists, and centuries later, the Hermetic philosophers of the Middle Ages. Whether it ever existed physically is doubtful, but as a concept, the Book of Thoth represented the ultimate synthesis of divine wisdom, hidden knowledge, and human aspiration. And it was always tied to the scribe, to the House of Life, to those who copied in darkness, who preserved even what they could not understand. But how did the whispers of this world, so fragile, so regional, travel across centuries to reappear in Latin manuscripts in medieval monasteries? Who carried the breath of Thoth across time? You left the dim hallways of the Per-Ankh in ancient Egypt behind, but the echo of papyrus turning still lingers. In this section, we follow that echo through fire, sand, and time. For the ancient scribes, what was written was sacred. But what happened when those texts left Egypt? Who preserved them? Who changed them? And who misunderstood them entirely? The journey of Egyptian knowledge did not end in Thebes or Memphis. It meandered through Alexandria, survived translation in Baghdad, was forgotten in monasteries, and reawakened in the minds of mystics. Alexandria, the bridge between worlds. Imagine a city where Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, Jewish mystics, and Roman administrators all shared the same crowded streets. Founded by Alexander the Great around 331 BCE, and ruled by the Ptolemies, Greek kings who adopted Egyptian customs, Alexandria was the first true intellectual melting pot of the ancient world. The famed Library of Alexandria, despite mythologization, did exist as a hub of learning and translation. Under Ptolemy I and his successors, the Greek world encountered Egyptian religious texts, many of which were not understood but admired. Egyptian priests translated temple texts into Greek, sometimes accurately, sometimes allegorically. This period saw the creation of the first syncretic theology when Greek gods merged with Egyptian ones. Thoth, for instance, was equated with Hermes, the Greek messenger god. This fusion produced a new figure, Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, whose wisdom was said to be both Egyptian and universal. Was Hermes Trismegistus a real person? No, but texts attributed to him, many inspired by Egyptian cosmology and temple ritual, formed the foundation of what would later be called Hermeticism. Yet even as these texts proliferated, much was already lost. Egyptian writing systems were complex, and only the Demotic script remained accessible to most Greek scholars. Hieroglyphs, sacred and dense with layered meaning, were increasingly misunderstood. The flame of knowledge flickered, and then, as often in history, it burned. The fires of loss and the refuge of memory. It's impossible to talk about Egyptian knowledge without talking about what was destroyed. The Library of Alexandria suffered multiple waves of destruction, likely not in one grand fire, but through a series of neglect, war, and ideological shifts. When the Romans took control of Egypt in 30 BCE, many temple functions were gradually replaced by imperial bureaucracy. The per ankh faded. Temples fell into disuse or were repurposed. The rise of Christianity in the 4th century CE brought further challenges. With the closing of pagan temples by decree under Emperor Theodosius I, c. 391 CE, many sacred sites, including houses of life, were shuttered or destroyed. Scribes could no longer operate openly. Scrolls were hidden. Some were buried. Some were copied by Christian monks who sought to preserve the philosophical core, stripped of its religious context. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, includes a collection of early Christian and Hermetic texts buried in jars sometime in the 4th century. These reveal how Egyptian thought was already transforming, repackaged into mystical Christian forms. The scrolls were not copied by priests of Thoth, but by Gnostic sects seeking divine knowledge beyond orthodoxy. Egyptian wisdom had already begun its metamorphosis. The Baghdad translators and the shadow of Thoth. By the 8th century, much of Greek learning had migrated eastward. In Baghdad, under the Abbasid Caliphate, a new renaissance of knowledge began. Greek texts, preserved and expanded by Syriac Christian scholars, were translated into Arabic at the House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah. While most of these were philosophical or medical texts from Plato, Aristotle, and Galen, there was a strong undercurrent of interest in the occult sciences, astrology, alchemy, and esoteric philosophy. Much of what was thought to be Greek wisdom bore Egyptian fingerprints, passed through Hermetic writings. Arabic Hermeticism fused with Persian and Indian thought, producing a new hybrid mysticism that would in turn influence European alchemy centuries later. In these circles, the name of Hermes Trismegistus, and thus Thoth, was known and revered. Yet few in Baghdad could read hieroglyphs. The Egyptian origins were symbolic, not linguistic. What was inherited was not the exact wording of Egyptian scribes, but the idea of an ancient, pure wisdom hidden, coded, and now available only through intense study and divine inspiration. The connection was blurred but not broken. Thoth had become a ghost in translation. Coptic keepers and the Christian memory of Egypt. While Greek and Arabic translators reshaped Egyptian knowledge abroad, a quieter preservation occurred at home. After the fall of pagan Egypt, the Coptic Christian Church emerged as a dominant force in Egyptian religious life. Coptic, a later form of the Egyptian language written in Greek script, was used in liturgy and scripture. Many early Copts were literate in both Coptic and Greek. Though hostile to pagan rituals, Coptic monasteries copied older texts for their historical, medical, or philosophical value. Zosimos of Panopolis, a 3rd–4th century Egyptian alchemist, stands out as a bridge between pagan and Christian Egypt. Writing in Greek, he compiled texts that blended Egyptian myth, alchemical practice, and mystical theology. Though his works would later circulate in Arabic and Latin, they originated in the dying embers of the Egyptian intellectual tradition. In the monasteries, scrolls became codices. Papyri were replaced with parchment. The act of copying continued, but now in service of a different god. Still, scribes copied alchemical treatises, translated earlier works, and even compiled magical spells, some of which had originally been inscribed in the houses of life, centuries earlier. The flame had not died. It had dimmed, flickered, changed color, but it burned still. The silence before the rediscovery. By the 11th century, much of the original Egyptian context for Hermetic texts had been lost. Hieroglyphs were no longer understood by anyone. The Rosetta Stone, which would later unlock them, sat unnoticed beneath centuries of soil. Egypt was now ruled by Islamic dynasties. Pilgrims and scholars still visited ancient ruins, but often interpreted them through the lens of legend and curiosity rather than archaeology. Temples became quarries for new buildings. Obelisks were mysterious objects, their inscriptions unreadable. In Europe, meanwhile, the Hermetic tradition was rediscovered not through direct Egyptian sources, but through Arabic translations brought via Spain and Sicily. European scholars, many working in monasteries or cathedral schools, encountered the works of pseudo-Hermes, as well as alchemical texts attributed to Thoth Hermes. These were not Egyptian in language, but Egyptian in flavor. They spoke of hidden wisdom, of correspondences between heaven and earth, of the transformation of the soul through sacred knowledge. For many in the Middle Ages, Hermes Trismegistus was believed to predate Moses, to be the original source of divine revelation. Egypt, in this view, was not a civilization, it was the cradle of eternal truths, distorted by time but traceable through careful reading. And so, the myth of Egyptian wisdom survived. It was no longer written in hieroglyphs or recited in temples. It was whispered in monasteries, mixed with the Psalms and Aristotle. It was invoked in spells, in grimoires, in the margins of Latin manuscripts. The voice of Thoth had become a rumor, but it had not vanished. A hidden thread in a larger tapestry. At every stage from Thebes to Alexandria, from Baghdad to Toledo, the knowledge once held in the Per-Ankh was transformed. Some of it was copied exactly. Much was reinterpreted, rephrased, or imagined. But always, the idea of Egyptian wisdom held a powerful allure. It promised something older than Rome, deeper than Christianity, and richer than philosophy. It represented a time when words were magic, when knowledge was sacred, when writing was not just communication but creation. In this transmission, accuracy was often sacrificed for inspiration. But perhaps that is part of the reason why Thoth's shadow lingered for so long. What happens when a tradition becomes so layered with interpretations that its origin is no longer visible? And how would medieval scholars, centuries later, try to reclaim a voice they could no longer read? You followed the faint ink trails of the Egyptian scribes through the fires of Alexandria, the translations of Baghdad, the quiet monastic copying in Coptic Egypt. But now, the story turns westward, to dusty cathedral libraries, cloistered monks, and strange figures in late medieval Europe, poring over Latin manuscripts lit by candlelight. What was once Thoth had become Hermes Trismegistus. What was once papyrus was now parchment. And what was once a Per-Ankh was now a stone scriptorium in Florence, Paris or Cologne, but something of the ancient voice remained. In this final section of Story 1, we examine how Egyptian wisdom reimagined, misinterpreted, and mystified was woven into the fabric of European intellectual and spiritual life from the 12th century through the Renaissance. The Latin Hermetica, Egypt by way of Spain. The 12th century translation movement marked a turning point in European intellectual history. In cities like Toledo, European scholars, often working with Jewish and Muslim intermediaries, translated Arabic manuscripts into Latin. Many of these texts dealt with science and philosophy, but Hermetic writings, alchemical treatises, and astrological manuals were also highly sought after. These texts were not direct translations of Egyptian works, but products of Greco-Egyptian synthesis filtered through Arabic commentary. Yet they were believed by many to be the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, who was assumed to be a real historical figure, perhaps older than Moses. To the medieval mind, Egypt represented the primordial origin of knowledge. There was no clear distinction between myth and history, between metaphor and literal fact. The idea that Egyptian priests had once held the secrets of the stars, the soul, and the cosmos seemed not only plausible, it seemed necessary. Thus, when Latin readers encountered the Corpus Hermeticum, a series of philosophical dialogues between Hermes and his pupil Asclepius, they read them not as curiosities, but as spiritual revelations from the distant past. Egypt had returned, but in translation and in disguise. The alchemists and the search for transformation. From the 13th century onward, alchemists across Europe began incorporating Hermetic ideas into their pursuit of transformation, not just of base metals into gold, but of the soul itself. Alchemy, which had Egyptian roots via Hellenistic Alexandria, thrived in this new soil. The famous Emerald Tablet, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, became a central text. Its cryptic maxim, "As above, so below," was taken as a guide to unlocking the correspondences between the macrocosm and the microcosm, the heavens and the earth. But few of these alchemists knew Egyptian. None could read hieroglyphs. Their understanding of Egyptian wisdom came from Arabic and Greek intermediaries, layered with Christian symbolism and medieval scholasticism. Still, the imagery of Egypt haunted their work. Alchemical treatises often included symbolic references to Isis, Osiris, and Thoth. The Egyptian gods had become allegories for natural processes, and Egypt itself had become a metaphor, a land of hidden knowledge, encoded in symbols, waiting to be revealed. Marsilio Ficino and the Hermetic revival. Perhaps the most significant figure in the Latin rediscovery of Hermetic thought was Marsilio Ficino, 1433–1499, a philosopher and translator in Florence. Working under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, Ficino was originally tasked with translating all of Plato's works into Latin. But he paused that project when he received a Greek manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum. Ficino believed, like many of his time, that Hermes Trismegistus was an ancient Egyptian sage whose wisdom predated and even informed Greek philosophy and Christianity. To him, the Corpus Hermeticum was a sacred text, revealing truths about the soul, the divine, and the cosmos. He translated it into Latin in 1463, publishing it as Pimander, and its influence was immediate and widespread. The text spoke of divine light, of human beings as reflections of cosmic order, and of spiritual ascent. It fit neatly into the Renaissance ideal of human dignity and the potential for inner transformation. Egypt was now fully absorbed into Christian Neoplatonism, not as a foreign culture, but as the forgotten source of divine knowledge. Ficino's translation sparked a flurry of interest in Hermetic texts, alchemy, astrology, and mystical philosophy across Europe. The voice of Thoth, though long mistranslated, was now loud once more. The invented past, fabrications and forgeries. As Hermeticism gained popularity in Europe, so too did fabricated Egyptian sources. Texts were written and falsely attributed to Hermes Trismegistus to lend them authority. Entire traditions like the Rosicrucians claimed to be the spiritual descendants of Egyptian priesthoods. This was the invention of Egypt, not the preservation of it. But these inventions had power. They inspired new modes of thinking, new sciences, and new art. Cathedrals were decorated with imagined Egyptian symbols. Secret societies claimed ancient lineages, and philosophical systems were constructed on the belief that ancient Egypt had encoded universal truths in its rituals and architecture. Was any of this historically accurate? No, but it mattered because people acted as if it were true, and in doing so, they transformed European intellectual life. Egypt had become a symbol, a cipher for wisdom just out of reach, and Thoth had become a mythical ancestor, invoked in laboratories, libraries, and illuminated manuscripts. The limits of understanding, hieroglyphs remained silent. Even as interest in Egyptian wisdom peaked in the Renaissance, no one in Europe could read actual Egyptian hieroglyphs. The symbolic interpretations of the Renaissance, where each glyph was thought to represent a mystical idea, were elegant, but wrong. It wasn't until Jean-François Champollion cracked the code in the 1820s, using the Rosetta Stone, that scholars could read the actual language of the Per-Ankh scribes. When they did, they discovered a world very different from the Hermetic fantasy. The texts were not filled with universal spiritual truths, but with hymns, prayers, tax records, funerary rituals, and daily accounts. They were, in a word, ordinary. Sacred, yes, but grounded in the real material life of temples, kings, and farmers. Thoth, it turned out, had not whispered esoteric truths. He had recorded census data, burial rites, and receipts for offerings. But does that diminish the impact of the Hermetic tradition? Or does it simply show how human beings across cultures and eras always seek deeper meaning in forgotten things? Reflection, Thoth's legacy in history and imagination. So what do we make of it all? The Per-Ankh scribes wrote to preserve ritual, identity, and power. Greek philosopher translated those rituals into metaphysics. Arabic scholars interpreted them as divine sciences. Medieval alchemists invoked them as keys to transformation. Renaissance mystics imagined them as the roots of all truth. And modern archaeologists uncovered the truth. These were not secrets, but systems records of a civilization that valued order, legacy, and the divine role of writing. The story of Thoth is not just about a god or a set of texts. It's about the long, slow journey of knowledge, how it changes, fragments, reassembles, and reawakens in new forms. It's about how history is remembered and reimagined, especially when so much is lost. And perhaps that's the true wisdom of Thoth, not what was written, but what endured. Not the spells or scrolls, but the belief that writing matters, that knowledge is sacred, and that even in obscurity, the quiet labor of scribes shapes the future. So the next time you hear the rustle of a page or see faded ink in an ancient hand, remember, you are hearing echoes, echoes from temples long vanished, from scribes long dead, from a house of life that, in its own way, never truly closed. Story 2. From Alexandria to Baghdad, the long journey of Egyptian texts. You're standing at a crossroads not of geography, but of language and culture. The dust of Egyptian temples clings to ancient scrolls, written in a script no one remembers how to read. But these scrolls did not remain buried. They traveled. They were copied, misunderstood, treasured, destroyed, and resurrected not in Egypt, but far to the east, in a new city of light and logic, Baghdad. This story is about the journey of texts, not people. It's about what happens when knowledge moves across borders, languages, and belief systems. It's not a heroic tale, but a slow, methodical one. The work of translators, of librarians, of scholars hunched over faded parchments, of scribes in cities you've never heard of. They're the ones who carried Egyptian ideas first transformed into Greek, then into Arabic across 1,000 years of history. And much of it began with a dream in a city by the sea. The Library of Alexandria, lost and found. The legend of the Library of Alexandria looms large. You've likely heard the tale of a vast library destroyed in a single tragic fire, but the reality is more complicated and far more interesting. Founded under Ptolemy I around 300 BCE, the library was part of the Mausoleum, a temple to the Muses and a royal research institute. Its goal was simple: to collect all knowledge. Ships entering the port were required to surrender any books on board. These would be copied, sometimes with the originals kept and copies returned. The result was a vast collection of works in Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Hebrew, and Indian traditions. Many Egyptian temple texts, originally written in Demotic or hieratic, were translated into Greek, some accurately, others through the lens of Hellenistic philosophy. Egyptian religious stories became allegories, rituals became symbols, Thoth became Hermes Trismegistus. But the dream didn't last. The library likely declined over centuries, not in a single fire but through repeated damage, budget cuts, and shifting priorities. By the 4th century CE, Alexandria had become a Christian city. Pagan texts were devalued and temple traditions dismantled. And yet some of the Greek texts survived. Preservation in the East, a Syriac lifeline. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed, much of its scholarly tradition was preserved in the East, especially in Byzantium and Persian Mesopotamia. Here, a quiet, often overlooked group played a pivotal role: Syriac Christians. Fluent in Greek, Syriac, and later Arabic, these scholars translated Greek philosophical, medical, and scientific texts into Syriac. Many were part of the Nestorian Church, which had been declared heretical by the Byzantines, and thus found refuge in the Persian Empire. One of the most important centers of this activity was Gundishapur, a Persian city with an academy that combined Greek, Persian, Indian, and Christian learning. Texts from Alexandria, already translated into Greek, were translated again into Syriac, and sometimes modified or annotated in the process. The focus wasn't on religion, but on medicine, logic, astronomy, and philosophy. And though these translators were not intentionally preserving Egyptian thought, they carried forward fragments of it embedded in Hermetic texts, Ptolemaic astronomy, and Galenic medicine, all of which had deep roots in the intellectual environment of Hellenistic Egypt. Egypt was no longer the source, but it was still the seed. The rise of the Abbasids and the House of Wisdom. Fast forward to the 8th century, and the Islamic world is expanding rapidly. In 762, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur founded a new capital, Baghdad. It was designed to be not just a political center, but an intellectual one. Here, under the reign of Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Mamun, the Abbasids created the legendary Beit al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom. Part library, part translation bureau, part observatory, it attracted scholars from across the known world. Greek texts preserved by Syriac Christians were now translated into Arabic. Teams of translators, often working in pairs, one fluent in Syriac or Greek, the other in Arabic, undertook massive efforts to bring ancient knowledge into the Islamic world. Among the most prominent translators was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Nestorian Christian who translated over 100 works of Galen, Plato, Aristotle, and Hippocrates. His Arabic translations were so clear and elegant that they remained in use for centuries, even after the Greek originals were reintroduced to Europe. And within many of these texts, especially in medicine, astronomy, and metaphysics, echoes of Egyptian knowledge persisted. Not directly, but through the layers of Greek interpretation that had emerged in Alexandria. The Hermetic texts in Arabic, between science and magic. Among the works translated in Baghdad were texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. These Hermetic texts, seen as ancient and authoritative, were treated not merely as curiosities, but as sources of science, ethics, and esoteric knowledge. Some Islamic scholars accepted Hermes as a prophet, perhaps even the same as the Quranic Idris believed to have built the pyramids and taught the stars to mankind. Whether or not this was historically accurate mattered little. It granted Hermes a place of respect in Islamic thought. One of the most influential Hermetic works in Arabic was the Emerald Tablet, Tabula Smaragdina, which included the famed line, "That which is above is as that which is below." This line, interpreted in various ways, influenced alchemical and astrological thinking. The Arabic Hermetic texts often combined technical knowledge like metallurgy and astronomy with mystical insights and numerological correspondences. Egypt had become a symbol again not of empire, but of ancient wisdom waiting to be unlocked. Al-Kindi and the rational Hermeticism. One of the most fascinating figures of this period was Al-Kindi, c. 801–873, often called the philosopher of the Arabs. A polymath who wrote on optics, cryptography, music theory, and metaphysics, Al-Kindi also engaged deeply with Hermetic texts. He did not accept all their claims uncritically. Instead, he sought to reconcile Hermetic ideas with Islamic theology and Greek rationalism, creating a kind of philosophical Hermeticism grounded in logic. For Al-Kindi, knowledge, whether it came from Egypt, Greece, India, or Persia, was valuable if it could be understood through reason. He wrote, "We should not be ashamed to acknowledge truth and assimilate it wherever it comes from, even if it comes from races distant and nations different from us." This attitude allowed Egyptian-rooted ideas to survive not as unchallengeable dogma, but as raw material for philosophical inquiry. The quiet work of copyists and commentators. While the great translators and philosophers made names for themselves, much of the real labor of transmission was done in silence. In Baghdad, in Damascus, in Cairo, copyists painstakingly reproduced Arabic manuscripts. Some were richly illuminated, others were plain. All were written by hand, letter by letter, line by line. Errors were corrected in the margins. Commentaries were added. Debates were recorded in footnotes. Sometimes a translator's note might mention that a passage came from the Greeks or even the Egyptians. But most of the time, the origin was forgotten. The knowledge itself became what mattered. And so, Egyptian concepts of celestial influence, of sacred geometry, of bodily transformation became embedded in Arabic texts that had no mention of pyramids, gods, or papyrus. They were no longer Egyptian, not in form, but their roots still drank from the Nile. The fragility of movement. This phase of the story, Alexandria to Baghdad, is one of quiet endurance, not glorious rediscovery. It's about how knowledge can move without fanfare, how scribes, translators, and librarians carry the world on their backs, and no one notices until centuries later. And it's about how fragile this process is. So many texts were lost, mistranslated, neglected, burned, or forgotten. So many ideas were altered beyond recognition, and yet something endured. Egyptian knowledge in its transformed Hermetic form made it from the Nile to the Tigris, from hieroglyph to Arabic script. Along the way it changed and yet remained. But what happened next would change the course of European history. Because soon these Arabic texts bearing traces of Egyptian roots would cross another border, this time into Europe. And the Europeans, too, were hungry for the past. You now stand at the edge of Europe in a land called Al-Andalus, what is now southern Spain. The sun here burns hot, and the air carries the sound of multiple tongues, Arabic, Latin, Hebrew, and the fading remnants of Greek. It is the 12th century, and a quiet revolution is underway, not on the battlefield, but in libraries, scriptoria, and workshops. The revolution is one of translation. The texts that once passed through Alexandria and were preserved and reshaped in Baghdad are now entering Europe, not as dusty relics but as living knowledge, scientific, philosophical, and mystical. For the Latin West, long trapped in narrow interpretations of theology, this influx feels like rediscovering a lost inheritance. And though Egypt is far away, its influence filtered through the centuries can now be felt in the candle-lit chambers of Toledo, Salerno, and Palermo. Toledo, a city of translators. Toledo had once been a Visigothic stronghold, but by the 12th century, it had become one of the most important cities in Christian Spain, recently reclaimed during the Reconquista. Crucially, it was also a city where Muslims, Jews, and Christians still lived together, uneasily but fruitfully. Its libraries held Arabic manuscripts that contained works of Greek, Persian, and Indian origin, many of them unknown in the Latin-speaking West. Among them were Hermetic writings, astrological treatises, and philosophical texts that carried distant echoes of Egyptian thought. This created a unique moment in European history, a second translation movement, in which scholars worked collaboratively across cultural and religious boundaries to bring ancient knowledge back into Latin. One of the most important figures was Gerard of Cremona, an Italian who moved to Toledo and spent decades translating over 70 Arabic texts into Latin, including Ptolemy's Almagest, Galen's medical treatises, and various works of Aristotle. While Gerard focused on astronomy and medicine, other translators turned to alchemical and Hermetic texts. The Emerald Tablet, already famous in the Islamic world, now entered Latin Europe. Its short but cryptic message about the unity of the cosmos became a foundational text for Western alchemy. The intermediaries, Jews and Mozarabs. The act of translation was not simply linguistic, it was cultural. Translators didn't just swap words, they interpreted, contextualized, and often altered meanings to fit new intellectual frameworks. Many translators worked in pairs. One person would read the Arabic aloud and explain it in the local vernacular, often a Romance dialect or Hebrew, and another would render it into Latin. Jewish scholars played a critical role here. Fluent in Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin, they acted as bridges between worlds. In cities like Lucena and Granada, Jewish intellectuals preserved and transmitted philosophical and mystical texts, some of which included elements of Neoplatonic and Hermetic thought derived from Egypt. So too did the Mozarabs, Christians who had lived under Islamic rule and were bilingual. Their exposure to Arabic culture and their Christian networks allowed for subtle cultural blending. This fragile ecosystem produced remarkable outcomes. In less than a century, Europe went from relative intellectual isolation to a flood of ancient knowledge, and beneath the surface, Egypt stirred. Salerno and Palermo, southern gateways. While Toledo was a hub for translation, southern Italy, particularly Salerno and Palermo, served as additional bridges for ancient knowledge. The Salerno Medical School, dating back to the 9th century, had absorbed Arabic and Greek medical knowledge, much of it rooted in the Alexandrian medical tradition. Egyptian medicine, filtered through Galen and Hippocrates, was now being taught to monks and physicians across Europe. Meanwhile, in Norman Sicily, under rulers like Roger II, Arabic, Greek, and Latin scholars worked side by side in court-sponsored translation projects. In Palermo, the ancient sciences of Egypt, now fused with Islamic astronomy and mathematics, found new audiences. Even cosmology carried Egyptian fingerprints. Many astronomical diagrams in Latin manuscripts during this period were based on Ptolemaic models, developed originally in Alexandrian Egypt, preserved through Arabic commentary. Though the scribes in Sicily and Salerno may not have known it, they were inheriting Egypt's intellectual DNA, passed from hand to hand over 1,000 years. Alchemy in Latin Europe, the return of the Emerald Tablet. Perhaps nowhere was the Hermetic influence more obvious than in alchemy, which took off in Europe shortly after the translation movement. The first Latin version of the Emerald Tablet appeared around the 12th century, often attributed to Belinas, an Arabized version of Apollonius of Tyana, a semi-legendary philosopher and magician. The Latin version included commentary interpreting its cryptic phrases. It is true, without falsehood, certain and most true. That which is above is like to that which is below, and that which is below is like to that which is above. This principle of cosmic correspondence resonated deeply with Christian mystics, Neoplatonists, and natural philosophers alike. To them, it validated the belief that the natural world mirrored divine order. But it also carried a hidden genealogy, one that traced back to Egyptian temple cosmology, where Ma'at, cosmic order, governed both earthly and divine realms. In a way, Latin alchemists were reenacting Egyptian beliefs, but without knowing their origin. Their laboratories became new houses of life, where scribes, experimenters, and seekers of transformation engaged in sacred work translating nature, transforming the self. Scholasticism meets Hermeticism. As universities emerged in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford in the 13th century, scholasticism became the dominant intellectual model. Logic, theology, and Aristotelian metaphysics ruled. Yet alongside this rational framework, Hermetic ideas lingered, often hidden in commentaries, footnotes, or marginal glosses. Albertus Magnus, a Dominican scholar and teacher of Thomas Aquinas, was known for his interest in alchemy and natural magic. Though committed to Aristotelianism, he believed in the occult properties of matter, a belief indirectly rooted in Egyptian sacred science. His student, Roger Bacon, argued that nature could be manipulated through secret knowledge, an echo of ancient Egyptian ritual practice now disguised as natural philosophy. And so, the language of reason was often spoken, with an Egyptian accent even if no one realized it. The disappearance of origins. By the late 13th century, most scholars working with Hermetic and alchemical texts had no idea where these ideas had originally come from. They saw them as universal truths, confirmed by observation or reason, not the legacy of a specific place. This forgetting was not a tragedy, but a transformation. The memory of Egypt, its scribes, rituals, gods, and philosophy had been rewritten so many times that it now wore European robes. But its core ideas endured. That the universe was structured and symbolic. That knowledge could be sacred. That the written word could influence the world. That human beings were microcosms of the cosmos. None of these ideas were uniquely Egyptian, but Egypt had once expressed them in a form that resonated so powerfully, it could not be forgotten even when the language was lost. A slow return to Alexandria. By the end of the 13th century, Latin Europe had absorbed much of the Greco-Arabic scientific tradition. Universities now taught Aristotle again. Medical schools used Galen. Astrologers drew up charts using Ptolemaic models. But a handful of scholars began to ask, where did this all come from? And as they traced the genealogies of knowledge, some looked past Greece and past Baghdad and began to speculate vaguely and romantically about Egypt. Egypt the origin, Egypt the mystery, Egypt the silent foundation beneath their towers of logic. But it would take another Renaissance, one born in Florence, for that speculation to become obsession. We arrive now in Florence. It's the late 15th century. The city hums with the sound of chisels against marble and the scratch of pens on parchment. Art, philosophy, architecture, and science all flourish under the wide patronage of families like the Medici. But beneath this rebirth of classical antiquity lies another rediscovery, less visible, more abstract, and more profound. A return to Egypt, not in the body, but in the mind. What began with scribes in ancient temples, passed through scrolls in Alexandria, and was transmuted in Arabic Baghdad, now finds a new vessel, the Renaissance humanist, searching for the soul of man in the fragments of forgotten wisdom. This is the climax of Egypt's long textual journey, but it is not a return to the real Egypt. It is a return to an imagined one filtered through Neoplatonism, bathed in Christian mysticism, and idealized by men who never saw the Nile. Ficino and the rediscovery of the Corpus Hermeticum. In 1460, Cosimo de' Medici, the powerful Florentine patron of arts and letters, received a gift, a Greek manuscript containing a collection of Hermetic dialogues attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. The manuscript had been brought from Macedonia by an Italian monk. Cosimo, then nearing the end of his life, immediately instructed his personal scholar, Marsilio Ficino, to set aside his translation of Plato, a monumental project, and translate the Corpus Hermeticum first. Ficino obliged. In his view, these Hermetic writings were older than Plato, perhaps the oldest philosophical writings in existence. They described a divine cosmology, a fall of the soul, and a path of return to the divine light. The texts read like a conversation between God and man, told through poetic language, mystical symbols, and esoteric teachings. Ficino published the translation under the title Pimander, and it quickly circulated among Europe's intellectual elite. To many, this was the pure wisdom of the ancients, unsullied by the rationalism of Aristotle or the rigidity of church doctrine. Egypt, or the idea of Egypt, had returned. The Hermetic Renaissance, Egypt in the Christian imagination. The Hermetic writings arrived at the perfect moment. Europe was in intellectual transition, moving from scholastic rigidity toward humanism, natural magic, and a deeper engagement with ancient pagan sources. Renaissance thinkers believed Hermes Trismegistus to be a real historical figure, a pagan prophet who had anticipated not only Plato and Moses, but even Christ. His writings were interpreted through a Christian Neoplatonic lens, blending classical philosophy with mystical theology. Egypt, in this worldview, was the cradle of all sacred knowledge. The pyramids were seen as temples of initiation. The hieroglyphs, still unreadable, were believed to be symbolic representations of divine truths. The priests of Thoth were imagined as philosopher kings, keepers of cosmic secrets. None of this was historically accurate, but accuracy was not the point. Egypt had become a mythic symbol, a cipher through which Renaissance thinkers projected their deepest desires: unity of knowledge, spiritual transformation, harmony between reason and faith. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, Syncretism and the Egyptian Flame. Another key figure of this period was Pico della Mirandola, 1463–1494, a prodigy who mastered multiple languages and philosophies by his early 20s. Pico believed that truth was universal and could be found in all traditions: Greek, Jewish, Christian, and yes, Egyptian. In his famous oration on the dignity of man, Pico described man as a being who could rise or fall according to his will, echoing Hermetic ideas of the soul's ascent and transformation. Pico studied not only Plato and the Bible, but also the Kabbalah, Arabic astrology, and the Hermetic texts. He believed they all came from a primordial source, an ancient wisdom tradition revealed first in Egypt. This belief in Prisca Theologia, a primeval theology, became a dominant idea in Renaissance esotericism. Egypt, for Pico and others, was not just a civilization. It was a lost Eden of knowledge, a golden age to be spiritually recovered. The symbolism of hieroglyphs, Egypt as visual language. During the Renaissance, hieroglyphs fascinated scholars and artists alike, even though no one could yet read them. The assumption, based on Greek sources like Horapollo, was that hieroglyphs were not phonetic but pure symbols, each one encapsulating a complex truth. This belief inspired a wave of symbolic art and emblem literature. Painters, poets, and architects borrowed Egyptian motifs to evoke the mystery of divine order, Obelisks were erected in Rome. Sphinxes appeared in paintings. Egyptian columns adorned gardens and fountains. Books like Athanasius Kircher's Oedipus Egyptiacus, 1652, though wildly inaccurate, cemented the idea that Egypt had used a perfect symbolic language, one that transcended mere words and touched the divine. In truth, hieroglyphs were a complex script mixing phonetic and ideographic signs. But in the Renaissance imagination, they became something else entirely: a visual theology, an iconography of eternal truths. Printing the past, the spread of Hermetic texts. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century transformed the Hermetic revival. Ficino's translations, Pico's orations, and new editions of magical, alchemical, and astrological texts began to circulate widely. By the early 1500s, Hermeticism was not just an intellectual movement but a cultural phenomenon. It influenced alchemical texts and experiments, astrological charts and planetary magic, Christian mysticism and contemplative prayer, architectural design based on geometric harmony, political philosophy, envisioning rulers as Platonic philosopher kings. And at the heart of all this was the myth of Egypt, a fantasy of the ancient world as unified, harmonious, and filled with wisdom lost to time. A sudden collapse, the chronological bombshell. The Hermetic Renaissance came to a sudden halt in 1614. That year, the Protestant scholar Isaac Casaubon published a critical analysis of the Corpus Hermeticum based on linguistic and historical study. His conclusion: the texts were not ancient at all. They were written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, long after Plato and the Hebrew prophets. They were products of Hellenistic Egypt, not its source. To modern readers, this is obvious, but to Renaissance thinkers, it was devastating. The entire timeline of sacred knowledge collapsed. Hermes was not older than Moses. The Hermetic writings were not pure revelations from a divine antiquity. Egypt's authority as origin was suddenly cast in doubt. But by then, it didn't matter. The myth of Egypt had already shaped European thought for 2 centuries. Even as its factual basis was undermined, its symbolic power remained. Reflection: the long echo. Let's take a step back. In the House of Life, Egyptian scribes recorded rituals and wisdom onto papyrus. In Alexandria, those texts were translated, reinterpreted, and mingled with Greek philosophy. In Baghdad, Arabic scholars preserved and expanded upon that knowledge. In Toledo and Palermo, it was translated into Latin, reimagined as ancient Christian truth. In Florence, it became the foundation for a new vision of humanity and the cosmos. This was not a straight line. It was a spiral, each era interpreting the past in its own image, layering meaning upon meaning. And at the center of that spiral stands a figure, Thoth Hermes, the imagined author of it all. A god, a sage, a myth, a symbol. We may never fully recover what the ancient Egyptians actually meant in their texts. But perhaps the real legacy of the Per-Ankh and the scribes of Thoth is not in the words themselves, but in the belief that knowledge matters, that writing is sacred, and that the search for wisdom is timeless. Story 3. Zosimos of Panopolis' Alchemy in the Coptic Twilight. You find yourself in Egypt again, but this is not the Egypt of pharaohs and monumental temples. The great houses of life are silent. Hieroglyphs, though still etched into crumbling stone, are no longer understood. The old gods Isis, Thoth, Horus have been supplanted by new religious forces. It is the 3rd century CE, a period of spiritual flux. Egypt is now under Roman rule. Pagan traditions are fading. Christianity is growing. Greek philosophy still lingers in Alexandria's schools, and scattered communities cling to mystical traditions that have outlived their political power. In this twilight era of ancient Egypt, a figure appears half scientist, half mystic, part priest, part philosopher. His name is Zosimos of Panopolis, and he is one of the earliest known alchemists whose writings survive. He does not work in a grand temple. He does not call himself a priest of Thoth, but in many ways, Zosimos is the final echo of the Egyptian scribe, one who writes not in hieroglyphs, but in Greek, not for kings, but for posterity. And what he records is one of the strangest and most revealing episodes in the history of ideas. Panopolis, a city between worlds. Zosimos was born in Panopolis, modern-day Akhmim in Upper Egypt. By his time, it had become a Roman provincial city with a hybrid culture: Greek-speaking elites, Egyptian rural populations, Christian converts, and lingering pagan cults. Temples were being closed. Monks were beginning to settle in the desert. But in the alleys of Panopolis, artisans and craftsmen continued to practice chemical arts, dyeing, metallurgy, medicine, and perfume-making techniques passed down for centuries. Zosimos came from this world. He belonged not to the temple or the academy, but to the workshop ergasterion. His writings are full of references to furnaces, alembics, steam distillation, and tinctures. Yet for him, these were not just material processes. They were spiritual metaphors. In Zosimos, chemistry becomes cosmology. The transformation of metals reflects the transformation of the soul. The furnace is not just a tool, it is a sacred space, a replica of the universe. What is alchemy to Zosimos? Alchemy, as practiced by Zosimos, is not about greed or gold. It is about purification, about transmutation not only of metals but of the self. The alchemist must be morally purified, spiritually disciplined, and intellectually trained. In his texts, Zosimos describes experiments, yes, but also visions, dreams, and allegories. One of his most famous writings, the Book of the Keys of the Work, describes a dream in which he sees a priest standing beside an altar. The priest is dismembered, and from his body emerges a fiery spirit, crying, "I am the image of the spirit, and I am slain in order to live, and I am transformed." It is a grotesque, mystical image, but one rooted in deep symbolism. To Zosimos, the alchemical process mirrors death and resurrection. The metal must suffer, die, and be reborn. So too must the alchemist. This idea, though expressed in Greek, echoes Egyptian themes. The myths of Osiris and rebirth, of the judgment of the soul, are not far away. But here, they are transformed, filtered through Platonic philosophy, Gnostic mysticism, and practical chemistry. The texts, fragmented and forgotten. Zosimos wrote extensively, but most of his works survive only in fragments quoted by later authors or preserved in Arabic translations. Among his known works are the Final Sayings, Logotelioudios, a collection of philosophical meditations; the Visions, Visio or Dream of Zosimos, a symbolic dream narrative; On the Divine Water, discusses distillation and spiritual fluids; the Book of the Keys of the Work, his main alchemical manual. He wrote in Greek, using dense allegorical language. Some passages read like technical manuals, others are full of riddles and obscure references. He refers to ancient sources, the books of Hermes, the teachings of Maria the Jewess, indicating a tradition he believed he was inheriting. Zosimos may have seen himself as one of the last of a dying lineage, a Greek-speaking Egyptian, trained in the old ways, recording secrets that would soon be lost. Egyptian knowledge beneath the surface. Zosimos does not mention Thoth directly. He does not use hieroglyphs, but Egypt is present beneath the surface. He speaks of divine fire, of the four elements, of sacred geometry, of initiation and death, themes deeply embedded in Egyptian temple ritual. He uses language that would resonate with Egyptian cosmology, even if expressed through Greek terminology. His references to Hermes Trismegistus, a frequent source in alchemical texts, suggest he saw himself as working within a Hermetic Egyptian lineage, even if that lineage had changed form. In one passage he writes, The ancient sages knew how to separate the soul from the body of metals, and in doing so, they revealed the divine nature within the material. Here, the Egyptian belief in divine essence, hidden in the material world, shines through. The alchemist becomes a kind of priest not of a temple, but of a furnace, and the purification of copper becomes an allegory for the purification of the human soul. A new kind of scribe. Zosimos is not copying sacred texts onto papyrus. He is not bound by temple hierarchy. Instead, he writes for posterity, for a community of seekers. His audience may have been small, perhaps just a few students or fellow experimenters, but he writes with urgency. He warns of false alchemists. He laments the loss of sacred traditions. He tries to preserve what he can. In doing so, he becomes a new kind of scribe, one working at the edge of a crumbling world, trying to carry forward a flame that others no longer see. In this way, Zosimos is both a product of his time and a witness to a long decline. He lives in the shadow of temples that once teemed with scribes, in a land whose gods have been overthrown. And yet, through his writings, the old spirit of inquiry, sacred, disciplined, transformative, continues. The role of women, Maria the Jewess. Zosimos frequently references a figure known as Maria the Jewess, or Maria Prophetessa, whom he calls one of the sages. She is credited with inventing several alchemical instruments, including the bain-marie, a water bath used in gentle heating, still used in modern laboratories. Her presence in his text suggests that alchemy in Egypt, unlike most formal sciences, may have included women. Maria's teachings, as quoted by Zosimos, emphasize patience, observation, and spiritual preparation. In one passage, Zosimos quotes her saying, "Join the male and the female, and you will find what you seek." This language of union of opposites, both symbolic and chemical, became a central motif in later alchemical traditions. Whether Maria truly lived or was a symbolic figure is unclear, but her inclusion shows that Zosimos saw knowledge as a lineage, passed from teacher to student, male or female, across centuries. And in that lineage, Egypt remained hidden but alive. The dream of the alchemist. In his most famous vision, Zosimos sees himself entering a temple or furnace, where he meets a priest of copper who undergoes violent dismemberment. This vision is rich with symbolism. The priest represents the metal undergoing purification. The sacrifice represents transformation. The temple is the body, and the furnace the cosmos. Zosimos writes, "I myself was the priest, and I suffered what I had seen. I awakened in fear." The vision blurs boundaries, between self and other, between dream and experiment, between matter and spirit. It is a deeply Egyptian moment, not in language, but in worldview. The self as vessel, the ritual of transformation, the journey through suffering into rebirth, these are themes that run from Osiris to the Book of the Dead to the heart of Zosimos' alchemy. A fading voice. By the time Zosimos wrote, the world he described was already fading. Temples were closing. Christian bishops condemned magical arts. Roman authority was crumbling. Yet Zosimos continued to write, teach, and dream. His texts would later be translated into Arabic, quoted by Islamic alchemists like Jabir ibn Hayyan, and eventually returned to Europe in Latin. Most readers never knew his name, but his language, his symbols, and his vision survived. And perhaps that is what he wanted most, not to be remembered, but to pass on the flame. But what happened to Zosimos' ideas after they left Egypt? How did they become part of the Islamic and European traditions of alchemy and mysticism? And what did later readers make of his dreams? The ink of Zosimos had barely dried when his world changed forever. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the temples of Egypt were shuttered, Greek philosophy was condemned as pagan heresy, and alchemy, already obscure, was driven underground. Yet the ideas Zosimos preserved did not vanish. They migrated, not westward into the Christian empire, but eastward into the growing intellectual heart of the Islamic world. In this section, we trace the unlikely path of Zosimos's ideas as they traveled across linguistic, religious, and philosophical frontiers, eventually reaching the vibrant scholarly circles of Abbasid Baghdad. His words would be read, reinterpreted, and expanded upon by Arabic-speaking alchemists, who preserved fragments of his writings even as they reimagined his meaning. And in the margins of those Arabic manuscripts, the spiritual voice of Zosimos, distorted perhaps, but not extinguished, continues to whisper. The translation begins, Greek into Syriac, Syriac into Arabic. Before Zosimos could be read in Baghdad, his Greek writings had to be translated, and the first step in that process occurred not in the Islamic world, but in the Syriac Christian communities of the Near East. These communities, especially in Edessa, Nisibis, and Gundishapur, acted as intellectual custodians, translating Greek texts into Syriac, the literary dialect of Aramaic. Though Zosimos's works were not widely known, certain extracts and fragments of Greek alchemical writings attributed to him were preserved in Syriac collections. From the 8th century onward, under the Abbasids, these texts began to enter Arabic thanks to the efforts of scholars working in the Beit al-Hikmah, House of Wisdom, in Baghdad. This translation movement brought hundreds of works on astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy into Arabic. Among them were alchemical texts, some attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, others to Zosimos, or to even more legendary figures like Democritus or Maria the Jewess. Zosimos's name began to appear in these texts, sometimes spelled Rasimus or Zeusimus. While no complete Arabic translation of his corpus survives, dozens of excerpts and adapted teachings do. In Baghdad, he was read not as a marginal figure of decaying paganism, but as an ancient master of chemical secrets worthy of respect, study, and sometimes criticism. Jabir ibn Hayyan and the Hermetic alchemical synthesis. No discussion of Arabic alchemy is complete without Jabir ibn Hayyan, Latinized as Jeber, a towering figure in early Islamic science. Writing in the 8th and 9th centuries, Jabir produced hundreds of treatises, some scientific, others mystical. He is known to have read and cited Zosimos, though through intermediaries. Jabir's writings reflect a similar worldview. The belief in the purification of matter. The idea that transformation of metals mirrors transformation of the soul. The use of symbolic language to conceal secrets from the uninitiated. In Jabir's works, we see Zosimos's legacy refracted through Islamic philosophy, particularly Neoplatonism and Shia esotericism. Jabir also expanded on the idea that alchemical knowledge came from ancient, divinely inspired sages including Hermes, Plato, and even Solomon. Though Jabir rarely mentions Zosimos by name, he cites teachings that resemble the Panapolitans. For example, the idea that metals contain spirits, or that alchemical vessels symbolize the cosmos. Through Jabir, the Zosimian worldview became embedded in Arabic alchemical thought, less as a set of doctrines, and more as a mode of inquiry, mystical, symbolic, and disciplined. Alchemy in the Islamic world, between science and spirituality. Alchemy in the Islamic world was never simply about turning lead into gold. It existed at the intersection of natural science, religious cosmology, and philosophical speculation. Thinkers like Al-Razi, 865–925, a Persian physician and chemist who wrote practical manuals for chemical processes. Ibn Umil, 10th century, a mystically inclined alchemist who preserved symbolic language similar to Zosimos's. Maslama al-Majridi and Avicenna, Ibn Sina, who critiqued alchemical ideas while still drawing from their cosmological assumptions. These scholars preserved fragments of Zosimos's themes and terminology, even when they rejected parts of his mysticism. In Arabic texts, Zosimos appears as a link in a chain of ancient sages, known not for his name but for his symbols: the furnace, the priest, the spirit in transformation. In many treatises, the dreams of Zosimos are reimagined as allegories of divine revelation, emphasizing the need for moral purification before engaging in alchemical work. Here, too, we find the Egyptian echoes, not explicit references to Thoth or Osiris, but the same belief that matter is sacred, that transformation is spiritual, and that the world is a mirror of the divine. Zosimos in the Book of Crates and the Emerald Tablet. Some of the best-known Arabic Hermetic works also reflect the influence of Zosimos' thinking, particularly in their visionary language and ritual symbolism. One example is the Book of Crates, Kitab al-Akalim, an alchemical treatise that presents allegorical dialogues between sages and kings. Though not directly attributed to Zosimos, it shares structural and thematic parallels with his writings. The emphasis on inner purification, the layered interpretation of symbols, the integration of spiritual visions with laboratory techniques. Another is the Emerald Tablet, often attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, whose line, as above, so below, echoes Zosimos' belief in correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm. These texts do not quote Zosimos directly, but they breathe the same air. The symbolic imagination he nurtured in panoplies had found a second life in Arabic. Translation into Latin, a third transformation. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Arabic texts, many of which contained fragments or ideas traceable to Zosimos, were translated into Latin in cities like Toledo and Salerno. In this process, Zosimos underwent yet another transformation. He became Zosimus, a legendary master alchemist of the past. His surviving fragments, especially his dream allegories, appeared in alchemical compilations such as Turba Philosophorum, Rosarium Philosophorum, Ardis Oriferae. These texts presented Zosimos not as a specific historical person, but as a timeless authority, his visions repackaged as allegories of Christian morality or Neoplatonic ascent. The dream of the priest being sacrificed in the furnace was now interpreted as a metaphor for Christ's crucifixion, or for the soul's struggle against sin. Once again, Zosimos' Egyptian core had been overlaid with new symbols, adapted for new audiences. The quiet transmission, a fragment here, a phrase there. Despite the lack of full manuscripts, Zosimos' legacy persisted in bits and pieces. A paragraph quoted by an Arabic scribe, a metaphor copied into a Latin manuscript, an alchemical diagram with an inscription, as taught by Zosimus, a visionary fragment reinterpreted as a Christian parable. Each time the original meaning was altered, but the tone remained, mysterious, intense, focused on purification and unity. This slow transmission resembles a kind of spiritual archaeology. Later thinkers did not know they were reading Zosimos, but they were shaped by him, by his metaphors, his structure, his unique fusion of laboratory and liturgy. Zosimos' alchemy without his name. By the Renaissance, when figures like Paracelsus and John Dee embraced alchemical imagery, they drew from traditions that had been shaped by Zosimos, even if they never read him. The idea that the alchemist is also a spiritual initiate. The lab is a temple. The metal has a soul. The process is one of death, suffering, and rebirth. All of these trace back to his 3rd century synthesis of Egyptian symbolism, Greek philosophy, and personal mysticism. Zosimos had become anonymous, his voice disassembled and redistributed across cultures. But his dream endured, a hidden current beneath the surface. Zosimos' story reminds us that intellectual transmission is never linear. Ideas do not move in straight lines from a to be. They fragment, transform, blend, and resurface in new shapes. His writings, born in the twilight of Egyptian tradition, lived on through Syriac translations, Arabic philosophical texts, Latin alchemical treatises, Renaissance esotericism. Each new culture saw something different in his visions. Each rewrote him in their own image, yet at the core remained a universal idea that the material world reflects the divine, that transformation requires suffering, that the search for knowledge is sacred. But how did Zosimos's dream end up influencing European mystics and Christian alchemists in the 16th and 17th centuries, men who knew nothing of panoplies? And what does it mean that the final echoes of Egyptian wisdom came not from priests, but from alchemists and visionaries? 1,000 years after Zosimos penned his final visions in panoplies, Europe awoke to a new fascination with the old, the lost sciences, the ancient wisdom, the sacred writings of forgotten ages. The Renaissance did not merely revive classical literature, it unearthed, reinterpreted, and reassembled fragments of past knowledge into new, powerful symbols. Among the rediscovered and reimagined traditions, alchemy stood at a curious crossroads. Part science, part spiritual discipline, part dream language, alchemy provided a rich field where Zosimos's influence reemerged indirectly but profoundly. In this final section, we explore how Zosimos, by now half legend, half shadow, haunted the minds of European scholars, mystics, and magicians. His writings were barely known by name, yet his visions, metaphors, and principles echoed loudly in Renaissance esotericism, Christian mysticism, and even early scientific thought. He had become what many ancient scribes dreamed of, a ghost in the margins, shaping minds centuries after his death. Zosimos in the Latin alchemical tradition. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Latin Europe had developed a rich alchemical literature, largely based on translations of Arabic works. These included the Turba Philosophorum, Rosarium Philosophorum, Liber de Perfecto Magisterio, Aurora Consurgens. These texts often did not cite sources directly, but in structure, symbolism, and allegory, they bore the unmistakable imprint of Zosimos filtered through Arabic intermediaries. Take, for example, the Rosarium Philosophorum, a 16th century compilation rich with allegorical illustrations and dream narratives. One image shows a king and queen uniting in a bath, symbolizing the conjunction of opposites, a theme present in Zosimos's dream visions. In another passage, the death of a mystical figure leads to the emergence of a fiery bird, a clear allusion to rebirth through sacrifice, mirroring Zosimos's priest in the furnace vision. Though his name is rarely mentioned, his language of transformation became foundational. Carl Jung and the rediscovery of the visions. Centuries later, in the 20th century, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology, rediscovered Zosimos through a study of alchemical texts. Jung saw in Zosimos a precursor to depth psychology. In particular, he was fascinated by the dream of Zosimos, which Jung read as a symbolic representation of the psyche's individuation, process, the journey toward integration of the self. For Jung, the alchemical furnace was the cauldron of the unconscious, and the dismemberment of the priest was a metaphor for the ego's confrontation with the shadow. Zosimos's language of death and rebirth, spirit and matter, was not just mystical, it was psychological. Jung wrote, "The operations of alchemy were real, but their true goal was not the transmutation of metals, but the transformation of the self." Thus, Zosimos, long dismissed by historians as obscure or irrelevant, was elevated by Jung as one of the earliest psychological philosophers. His visions became not relics, but living symbols of the soul's journey. Zosimos had survived not by being remembered, but by being felt. The Hermetic chain and the return of Egyptian wisdom. During the Renaissance, scholars like Pico della Mirandola, Giordano Bruno, and later Robert Flood and Michael Mayer, embraced the idea of a Hermetic chain, a line of transmission stretching from Egyptian sages, through Greek philosophy, into Christian mysticism. Though the actual figure of Zosimos was often omitted from this imagined genealogy, his themes were present. The allegorical structure of nature, the importance of visionary knowledge, the soul's ascent through suffering and purification, the view of matter as infused with divine intelligence. In this way, Zosimos became part of the fabric of Renaissance Hermeticism, not through explicit reference, but through shared myth and metaphor. His imagery of sacred vessels, divine fire, alchemical marriage, and spiritual death was now everywhere, used in grimoires, alchemical illustrations, and mystical theology. He had become ubiquitous by anonymity, a legacy without attribution. Zosimos's fate is a rare one in the history of thought, influential yet unacknowledged. Why? His original Greek texts were lost or fragmented. His Arabic representations often omitted his name. His Latin legacy came through symbols, not citations. His voice was heard, but his face was forgotten. But perhaps this was fitting. Zosimos himself warned that true alchemical knowledge must be hidden, cloaked in allegory, protected from the uninitiated. In a way, his invisibility was intentional, a final layer of alchemical transformation. His name dissolved, but his essence remained. Like the metals he wrote about, his teachings underwent calcination, dissolution, sublimation until they no longer resembled their source, but bore the energy of its intention. The final furnace, from symbol to science. By the 17th century, alchemy was under siege. The rise of experimental science, led by figures like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton, transformed the study of matter from mystical inquiry to mechanical explanation. Yet even here, Zosimos lingered. Newton himself was a student of alchemy and owned copies of alchemical manuscripts with Hermetic and Zosimian imagery. In Newton's private notebooks, he copied passages about purification through fire, spiritual metallurgy, and the balance of nature clearly drawn from older, symbolic traditions. While science moved toward empiricism, the language of alchemy, Zosimos's language, remained as symbolic substructure, quietly informing metaphors of transformation, energy, and unity. The furnace became a laboratory, the priest alchemist a chemist, and the sacrifice of metals a reaction of elements. Yet the mystery, the wonder, the spiritual resonance, those, too, were part of the human story Zosimos carried. A thoughtful reflection, the anonymous immortality of the scribe. Zosimos lived in a fading world. The temples were closing, the gods were silent. Greek was no longer the language of power. Egypt was being absorbed by empires whose imaginations lay elsewhere. And yet Zosimos wrote. He recorded his dreams. He described his furnaces. He warned of false paths and cheap imitations. He saw the alchemy of the world not as a way to gain gold, but as a path to reintegrate the cosmos and the soul. His writings were lost, translated, mistranslated, repackaged, quoted, misattributed, and yet they moved. They touched Syriac monks, Baghdadi philosophers, Latin monks, German mystics, Swiss psychologists, and still today, readers who see in his visions something hauntingly eternal. He is a scribe without a scroll, a priest without a temple, a teacher whose classroom is time itself. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Zosimos, that what we create in truth, with intention and humility, may live far beyond us, uncertain in form, but enduring in meaning. Story 4. The Corpus Hermeticum in Byzantium, dust on the scrolls. The year is 900 CE. The Byzantine Empire still stands. Hagia Sophia rises in Constantinople like a beacon of old-world grandeur. Greek is still spoken here, long after the Western Roman Empire has fallen into dust. And inside the dusty scriptoria of monastic libraries, A small collection of curious texts sits untouched texts attributed to an ancient Egyptian sage, now barely remembered. This is not a story of discovery or revival. It is a story of preservation without purpose, of books that were copied without readers, and of wisdom that was stored like grain in sealed jars, waiting for a famine of knowledge that would come centuries later. At the heart of this tale lies the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of mystical dialogues attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, believed in antiquity to be the Egyptian god Thoth, transformed into a Hellenistic philosopher-priest. In the West, these texts would one day spark the Renaissance, but before that, they had to survive. And it was the Byzantine Empire, not Rome, not Cairo, not Baghdad, that would accidentally guard them, almost without knowing. Byzantium, a world between ages. The Byzantine Empire is often seen as a bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds. It was Christian, yes, but inherited the vast libraries, bureaucracies, and traditions of the pagan Roman world. Unlike Western Europe, where Latin dominated and literacy declined after the fall of Rome, Byzantium retained Greek language and learning. Its monasteries and court schools preserved works by Plato, Aristotle, Galen, and many others. But Byzantium was also selective. Church doctrine guided what was copied, what was taught, and what was ignored. Pagan philosophy was tolerated, but only when filtered through orthodoxy. So what happened to the Hermetic texts, with their talk of gods, divine mind, reincarnation, and the ascent of the soul? They were not burned. They were not widely read. Instead, they were simply ignored, shelved in obscure corners of libraries, forgotten but preserved. What was the Corpus Hermeticum? The Corpus Hermeticum is not one book, but a collection of philosophical dialogues, written in Koine Greek between the 1st and 4th centuries CE in Rome and Egypt. They reflect a fusion of Egyptian religious thought, Platonic philosophy, and Stoic cosmology. The central themes include the divine origin of the soul, the illusion of the material world, the ascent of the soul through gnosis, knowledge, the unity of all things, the belief that humans are microcosms of the cosmos. These dialogues, especially Poimandres, the first in the collection, describe visions, mystical revelations, and initiatory wisdom. They were likely composed by Hellenized Egyptians, blending local religious ideas with Greek philosophy. By late antiquity, they had become part of the pagan intellectual tradition referenced by Neoplatonists, admired by Gnostics, and later condemned by Christians. And yet in Byzantium they endured. Who copied them and why? The precise chain of copyists and scribes who preserved the Corpus Hermeticum in Byzantium is largely unknown. Unlike major works by Plato or Aristotle, the Hermetic writings were not taught in the imperial schools. But we know they were copied, likely in monastic scriptoria. Why? There are several possible reasons. Curiosity. Byzantine scribes sometimes copied unusual or obscure texts simply to preserve what existed in old libraries. Philosophical interest. Though not mainstream, Neoplatonism remained alive in Byzantium, especially in philosophical schools like Athens and Alexandria. Antiquarian habit. Byzantine scholars often prized ancient texts for their age alone, not their content. Whatever the reason, at least one manuscript containing much of the Corpus Hermeticum survived in Byzantium and was eventually brought to Italy in the 15th century, just before the Ottoman conquest. The Byzantine scribes may not have understood the significance of what they copied, but without their quiet work, the Renaissance Hermetic revival would never have happened. A text without a reader. In Byzantium, the Hermetic texts were culturally homeless. They were too pagan for Christian theologians, too mystical for rational philosophers, too Egyptian for Roman traditionalists, too Hellenistic for emerging Orthodox spirituality. They were rarely cited. They were never canonized. They appeared in no reading lists, but like a family heirloom kept in a drawer, they remained. This was preservation not by reverence, but by neglect. And yet, the very disinterest that kept them from circulation also protected them. No one bothered to destroy what no one read. Byzantine hesitation toward pagan mysticism. It's important to understand that Byzantium was wary of esotericism. After the 6th century, following the closure of the Neoplatonic Academy in Athens by Emperor Justinian, the Church sought to limit the influence of pagan thought. Christian theology became dominant, and the mystical speculation found in the Corpus Hermeticum was seen as dangerous or useless. There were exceptions. Figures like Michael Sellos, 11th century, studied Neoplatonism and occasionally cited ancient sources. But even Sellos kept a safe distance from overtly mystical or magical texts. Hermetic writings, with their cosmic metaphors, multiple gods, and non-Christian eschatology, were just too ambiguous. And yet they were Greek, they were old, and that was enough. They continued to be copied, perhaps for their language, for their structure, or simply because they were part of the inheritance. The manuscript that crossed the sea. One of the most important moments in the survival of the Corpus Hermeticum was the escape of a single manuscript from Byzantium to Florence. In the early 15th century, with the Ottoman threat looming, Byzantine scholars began traveling west, bringing with them manuscripts in ancient Greek that had long vanished from Western libraries. One such scholar was Leonardo of Pistia, a monk who brought the Corpus Hermeticum manuscript to Cosimo de' Medici in Florence. This manuscript, containing at least 14 Hermetic treatises, became the basis for Marsilio Ficino's Latin translation, Pimander, a foundational text of the Hermetic Renaissance. The irony is striking. Byzantium preserved the texts but didn't read them. Renaissance Italy read the texts but misunderstood their origin. And modern scholars pieced together the fragments, finally seeing them in their historical context. Without the Byzantine monks and copyists, there would be no Ficino, no Pico, no Hermetic revival. Their anonymity is their legacy. Thus, as protection, the story of the Corpus Hermeticum in Byzantium is one of preservation through disinterest. This may feel anticlimactic, but it's a crucial theme in history. Some of the most important knowledge survives not through heroic efforts, but through bureaucratic habit, monastic inertia, or intellectual fashion. And often, what is ignored in one era becomes revolutionary in another. So when we speak of Zosimos, Thoth, or Hermes Trismegistus, we must also honor the nameless Byzantine scribes who took up their stylus, lit their oil lamp, copied strange texts in silence, closed the scroll, and moved on. You are in a cold scriptorium, its air faintly metallic, scented by ink and the dry rustle of parchment. A scribe hunched in a darkened corner dips his reed pen into soot-black ink and traces careful letters across the creamy surface of vellum. He doesn't know the name of the person who wrote the words he's copying. He may not even understand their meaning, but he knows this. It is old, and old means important. This is how the Corpus Hermeticum survived the Middle Ages. It was not preserved because of its doctrine or its authorship. It was preserved because it was written in Greek, and Byzantium, alone among medieval societies, still trained men to read and copy Greek texts even when those texts were full of pagan cosmology, divine emanations, or mystical unions of mind and matter. In this section, we delve into the mechanics of memory, how the Corpus Hermeticum moved through time in ink, scratches, and marginalia, thanks to the persistence of scribes who didn't necessarily believe its message, but believed in the value of copying it anyway. The manuscript tradition in Byzantium. Unlike modern books, which are mass-produced and uniform, ancient and medieval manuscripts were unique, individual artifacts. Each copy had a story. Each reflected its scribe, its materials, and its cultural moment. The Corpus Hermeticum likely survived in just a handful of Greek manuscripts between the 6th and 15th centuries. Most were stored in monasteries, some in imperial libraries, others perhaps in private collections belonging to scholars or mystics. The most important surviving manuscript is known as the Florentine manuscript, Laurentianus Plut, 71.33, the one brought to Florence in the 1460s, but other fragments and variants existed cited occasionally in Byzantine lexicons or philosophical summaries. The copying of such texts was laborious. Preparation of parchment, often scraped from animal skin. Hand-traced letters, requiring precise and uniform penmanship. Margins filled with notes, sometimes personal, sometimes instructive. Binding, which might combine unrelated texts into a single codex. Texts like the Hermetica often appeared alongside more familiar works: Plato, Aristotle, medical treatises, astrological manuals. In this way, they were not viewed as sacred or even especially meaningful, just part of the intellectual debris of antiquity. But because they were rare, they were also valued. The marginalia, traces of life on the page. It's in the margins that we sometimes glimpse the only signs of the reader's mind. In one manuscript containing Hermetic content, a Byzantine scribe adds a small note. Obscure, possibly Gnostic, retained for completeness. In another, an unfamiliar word is circled with a question mark beside it, a rare admission of confusion. These tiny human marks inked between the lines or tucked into corners are some of the only evidence we have that these texts were noticed, even if not fully understood. Occasionally, theological warnings were scribbled beside more mystical passages. Heretical if taken literally, allegory. This hesitation reflects the precarious status of the Corpus Hermeticum in Byzantine culture, too philosophical to be discarded, too pagan to be trusted. The hidden influence of Neoplatonism. Although the Hermetic texts were rarely cited directly in Byzantine philosophy, their worldview resonated with Neoplatonism, which survived in certain Byzantine intellectual circles, particularly in Alexandria, Athens, and Constantinople. Neoplatonism taught that the world emanates from a single divine source. The soul descends into matter and must return upward through knowledge. Symbols, rituals, and inner purification can accelerate this return. These ideas mirrored many Hermetic themes. Though Byzantine scholars such as Michael Sellos and John Idalos didn't quote the Corpus Hermeticum, they operated within a shared conceptual framework, a cosmos suffused with meaning, where philosophy was not just argument but assent. It's possible that the Hermetica functioned as a background influence, read occasionally, referenced obliquely, and remembered not as texts but as atmosphere. The role of monastic libraries. The monasteries of Byzantium were both guardians and graveyards of knowledge. Texts were preserved, copied, stored, and often forgotten, but monks were compulsive archivists. They saved even what they didn't like. A book might sit untouched for generations, wrapped in leather and stacked beside liturgical volumes. In some cases, monastic scribes preserved ancient texts without fully recognizing their origin. A treatise attributed to Hermes might be mistaken for a moral discourse or a theological meditation. It was not until the 14th century that scholars began cataloging manuscripts more systematically. Even then, the Corpus Hermeticum was rarely noted. It existed in a blind spot, copied without fanfare. And yet, through those centuries of silent stewardship, it survived. The fall of Constantinople and the Great Dispersion. Everything changed in 1453 when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. Many Greek scholars fled westward, carrying books, manuscripts, and knowledge previously unknown to Latin Europe. This intellectual diaspora brought Plato, Ptolemy, and Plotinus to the desks of Renaissance humanists, but also the Hermetica. One of the refugees was John Argyropoulos, a Byzantine scholar who taught Greek in Florence and translated Aristotle. Others brought uncatalogued manuscripts, including the Laurentianus. To Western eyes, the Corpus Hermeticum was a treasure not dusty, obscure philosophy, but ancient divine wisdom. They believed it predated Moses, perhaps even Adam. The Byzantines had protected the body of the Hermetic tradition. Now the Italians gave it new life. Byzantine skepticism, Western enthusiasm. In a curious reversal, the Byzantines had been cautious, too cautious, perhaps to explore the Hermetica's mystical implications. But Renaissance thinkers, unburdened by orthodox dogma and drunk on classical rediscovery, embraced the texts with exuberant certainty. To Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, the Hermetica were not just pagan musings, they were foundational truths, unlocking a Prisca theologia, or primordial theology. What the Byzantines had shelved as relics, the Italians enshrined as revelation. And in that transformation, the Hermetica gained influence but lost historical accuracy. Egypt was now seen not as a specific place, but a symbol of the timeless sacred. A culture of quiet preservation. Byzantium is rarely remembered for its contributions to Hermeticism. Yet without it, the entire Hermetic Renaissance would have been impossible. This is a reminder that not all legacies are loud. Some come from monks copying words they don't understand, scholars preserving books they won't read, scribes adding a cautious retain for completeness in a dusty margin. The Hermetica were preserved not by belief, but by bureaucracy. And in doing so, Byzantium became the silent bridge between Egypt and the Renaissance. But what did Renaissance thinkers actually do with the Corpus Hermeticum once it reached Italy? How did their enthusiastic misreading of these texts reshape European thought? And how did their fantasies about ancient Egypt diverge from the reality preserved by the Byzantines? The last we saw of the Corpus Hermeticum in Byzantium, it sat largely unread, cloaked in obscurity. But when the manuscript arrived in Florence in the mid-15th century, carried by an émigré monk fleeing the fall of Constantinople, it landed in fertile intellectual soil. Renaissance Italy was already looking backward toward ancient Greece, Rome, and the imagined purity of forgotten truths. And so the Corpus Hermeticum, copied by Byzantine monks out of habit or duty, would be reborn not as it was, but as what Renaissance thinkers wanted it to be, the spiritual cornerstone of all ancient wisdom. This final section of Story 4 explores how the Hermetic texts were reinterpreted, misread, and transformed in the hands of thinkers like Marsilio Ficino, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and others. Their passion for the Corpus Hermeticum ignited the Hermetic Renaissance, but their understanding of its origins and meaning was deeply flawed. And yet, their errors gave rise to ideas that would shape the Western imagination for centuries. Ficino's translation, the spark of revival. In 1463, Cosimo de' Medici received a Greek manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum. Aware of his age and mortality, Cosimo interrupted the translation of Plato, then being carried out by Marsilio Ficino, and ordered him to translate the Hermetic texts first. Ficino obeyed, and within months, the Corpus Hermeticum was translated into Latin and published under the title Pimander. He believed, like many of his time, that Hermes Trismegistus was a pre-Mosaic prophet, a sage from deep antiquity whose writings had inspired Greek, Jewish, and Christian traditions alike. In the Pimander, Ficino and his contemporaries found what they were looking for: a divine cosmology that didn't contradict Christian doctrine, a philosophical mysticism that resonated with Neoplatonism, a language of ascent, of purification, of the human soul seeking union with the divine. The Hermetic texts, translated into Latin, were received not as Greek syncretic literature, but as revelations from ancient Egypt. Ficino wrote of Hermes with awe, believing he represented a universal theology, a timeless truth suppressed by the centuries. The Prisca Theologia, a convenient fiction. Ficino's friend and fellow philosopher, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, developed this idea into a broader theory he called Prisca Theologia, the ancient theology. Pico believed that all religions, philosophies, and sacred traditions stemmed from a single divine source. He placed Hermes Trismegistus at the head of this lineage, followed by Zoroaster, Orpheus, Pythagoras, Plato, Moses, Christ. To Pico, Hermes was not a myth but a historical prophet, perhaps even the first human to write down divine truths. This reading ignored the real origin of the Corpus Hermeticum, a series of philosophical dialogues written in Hellenistic Egypt between the 1st and 4th centuries CE. Their authors were likely Alexandrian mystics, blending Egyptian religious language with Platonic metaphysics. But the Renaissance scholars didn't know that, and more importantly, they didn't want to know. Their Hermeticism was aspirational, not historical. It gave them a myth of origin, an idea of Egypt not as a real culture, but as a symbol of timeless wisdom. Egypt as sacred symbol. In this Renaissance worldview, Egypt was imagined as the cradle of divine knowledge, a place where priests and philosophers worked together, a land of pure geometry, perfect hieroglyphs, and sacred rituals, the birthplace of theurgy, astrology, and the sacred sciences. None of this matched the reality of late-period Egypt under Roman rule, where the Hermetic texts were actually composed. But this fictional Egypt served a cultural purpose. It allowed Renaissance thinkers to legitimize their new fusion of Christianity and Neoplatonism, and to reclaim ancient wisdom without challenging the Church directly. By invoking Egypt, they invoked a past older than Moses, older than Greece, older than history itself. The problem of chronology, Casaubon's bombshell. This illusion endured until the early 17th century, when a Protestant philologist, Isaac Casaubon, published a critical analysis of the Corpus Hermeticum in 1614. By analyzing the Greek language and syntax of the texts, Casaubon demonstrated that they could not possibly have been written before the 2nd or 3rd century CE. They were post-Platonic, not pre-Mosaic. They were products of Hellenistic Alexandria, not primeval Egyptian temples. This revelation shattered the myth of Egyptian precedents. Hermes Trismegistus was not an ancient sage, but a literary construct. The Corpus Hermeticum was not a divine revelation, but a set of mystical philosophical reflections, beautiful, meaningful, but not ancient in the way the Renaissance had claimed. For many, this felt like a betrayal, but the damage had already been done, or perhaps the seeds had already been planted. The fruits of misreading. The Renaissance misreading of the Hermetica gave rise to Christian Kabbalah, a fusion of Jewish mysticism and Hermetic thought; Rosicrucianism, a secretive brotherhood that claimed lineage from ancient Egyptian sages; symbolic architecture, temples, gardens, and cathedrals built on Hermetic proportions; the Egyptian mysteries, imagined initiatory rituals influencing Freemasonry and Western esotericism; natural magic, the belief that divine powers could be accessed through natural correspondences; Zosimos's spiritual furnace and Hermes, divine cosmos became icons for new traditions, stretching from alchemy to Renaissance medicine, astrology, psychology, and occult philosophy. Even when the scholarly basis collapsed, the emotional and imaginative power of these ideas remained. Legacy beyond the texts. Ironically, it was the errors of Renaissance thinkers that gave the Corpus Hermeticum its greatest cultural impact. Had they known the truth that the texts were late and syncretic, they might have dismissed them. But because they believed the Hermetica to be ancient, they treated them with reverence. That reverence inspired generations of thinkers to explore the relationship between matter and spirit, the symbolic structure of the cosmos, the idea that the soul can ascend through wisdom and purification. In doing so, they reawakened ancient patterns of thought, even if the historical details were wrong. Egypt, though silent, was speaking again. Final reflection: the power of misunderstood memory. The story of the Corpus Hermeticum is not one of continuous use, but of strategic forgetting and sudden rediscovery. Preserved by the Byzantines, who didn't read it. Misread by the Renaissance, who cherished it. Dismissed by the Enlightenment, who dissected it. Re-examined by the modern era, which sought its context. And through it all, the voice of Thoth, now Hermes Trismegistus, shifted shapes: god, sage, prophet, philosopher, forgery, symbol. The scrolls sat in dust for centuries, but when they were opened, they changed everything. Sometimes, the most powerful books are not the ones most often read, but the ones read at the right time, by people desperate to believe. And perhaps, in that moment of hopeful misreading, Egypt spoke its last great secret. That truth is not only what is written, but also what others need it to be. Story 5. Marsilio Ficino and the Revival of Thoth's Voice. It is the year 1463. In Florence, the sun warms the arches of San Marco, casting long shadows across the cloisters. Inside a modest study, lit only by a small oil lamp in the last light of dusk, a scholar bends over a manuscript written in ancient Greek. The pages are worn, the letters unfamiliar, but the translator is focused, aware that these words, once spoken in Egyptian temples and copied in Byzantine scriptoria, have finally arrived at a new beginning. The scholar is Marsilio Ficino. The manuscript before him is the Corpus Hermeticum, and the task at hand is not just translation, it is revival. Ficino believed he was unsealing a sacred voice from antiquity, the voice of Hermes Trismegistus, the mythical synthesis of the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes. But in truth, he was giving shape to a European fantasy of Egypt, carefully constructed through ink, longing, and misinterpretation. This is the story of how one man's pen gave new life to ancient whispers, and how his work lit a fire that would smolder in secret libraries, alchemical laboratories, and the hearts of mystics for centuries. The setting: Florence and the dream of antiquity. The Florence of the 15th century was a city in love with the ancient world. Under the patronage of the powerful Medici family, artists and scholars sought not only to imitate antiquity, but to resurrect it. Cosimo de' Medici, Florence's elder statesman and unofficial ruler, had established a kind of Platonic academy, not a formal institution, but a circle of thinkers who gathered to discuss philosophy, art, astrology, and the harmony of the cosmos. At the center of this intellectual circle was Marsilio Ficino, 1433–1499, a Catholic priest, physician, and linguist, deeply influenced by Neoplatonism, especially the works of Plotinus and Plato. Ficino had been hard at work translating Plato's dialogues into Latin, introducing them to a Europe still steeped in scholastic Aristotelianism. But that changed abruptly when, in 1463, Cosimo presented him with a Greek manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum, recently arrived from Constantinople. Cosimo, now old and unwell, asked Ficino to pause his Plato and translate Hermes first. He did not realize that in doing so, he was handing Ficino a myth, a project, and a mission. Ficino's translation: Pimender Reborn. Ficino translated the text into Latin in a matter of months, titling it Pimender, after the first and most influential dialogue in the collection, Poimanders in Greek. This work, like others in the corpus, consists of a visionary dialogue between Hermes and a divine, mined an account of the cosmos's creation, the soul's descent into matter, and its possible return through knowledge, gnosis. To Ficino, these texts were revelations, direct messages from an ancient, sacred source. He wrote of Hermes as a prophet, a theologian, and perhaps even a precursor to Moses. He believed that Hermes had lived in Egypt long before Plato, Pythagoras, or Abraham, a holy man who passed divine wisdom down through time. Ficino saw in the Hermetica a cosmology consistent with Christian creation, a spiritual anthropology that portrayed man as made in the image of God, a method for ascent, for returning the soul to its divine origin. His translation was soon copied, printed, and read widely. Europe, long cut off from the mysteries of Alexandria, now had in its hands a visionary map, even if the landmarks were imaginary. Ficino's theology, between Christ and Hermes. Ficino was not a heretic. He remained a devout Christian and sought always to harmonize ancient pagan thought with Christian doctrine. He did not see Hermes as a rival to Christ, but as a precursor, a kind of pagan evangelist who glimpsed, dimly, the truth of God before revelation was complete. In Ficino's eyes, Hermes taught the unity of all things, just as Paul would later write. He described a spiritual ascent, not unlike Christian salvation. He revered a single divine source, even if cloaked in pagan terms. Ficino wove Hermetic ideas into his commentaries on Plato, his own philosophical writings, and even his sermons. He believed in the power of symbols, astrological correspondences, and natural magic, not for superstition's sake, but as spiritual tools to align the human soul with divine order. Hermes, for Ficino, was not a magician. He was a doctor of the soul. Reception and spread, a Europe ready to listen. Ficino's Pimender quickly found an audience among scholars, artists, and mystics. Painters like Botticelli drew on its imagery of cosmic harmony. Philosophers like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola built systems of universal theology upon its metaphysics. Astrologers and alchemists saw in it validation of their craft. Even theologians, cautiously, engaged with its notions of divine intellect and the human soul. The Corpus Hermeticum became a kind of scriptural supplement, cited in treatises, quoted in letters, and taught alongside Plato and the Bible. It offered a language of unity at a time of growing religious and scientific division. Its influence spread beyond Italy to Germany, France, England. In the Rosicrucian manifestos of the early 17th century, Hermes was hailed as the root of secret wisdom. In the Masonic lodges of Enlightenment Europe, his name appeared in rituals and architecture. The voice of Thoth, reimagined as Hermes, had returned. A beautiful misunderstanding. But Ficino was wrong. We now know that the Corpus Hermeticum was not written in the time of Moses, or even Plato. It was composed in Rome and Egypt, centuries after both a syncretic blend of Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, and Hellenistic spirituality. Ficino didn't know that. He read allegories as historical truths. He misunderstood the authorship, the date, the language, and the cultural context. And yet, his mistake was productive. By misreading the Hermetica as primordial revelation, he helped create a new language of spirituality, one that offered an alternative to rigid scholasticism and dry dogma. He revived the ancient idea that the universe is a living symbol, that the soul is not fallen but divine, that wisdom is something felt, not merely taught. His Hermeticism was not Egyptian, but it was inspired. The fate of Ficino's Hermetica. The Pimender remained popular for over a century, influencing magic, science, medicine, and theology. But after Isaac Casaubon's analysis in 1614, which dated the texts to late antiquity, the authority of the Hermetica collapsed. Rationalists dismissed them as nonsense. The Church viewed them with suspicion. Philosophers moved on. but in the shadows in secret societies, in esoteric schools. In the imagination of poets, the vision Ficino gave form to remained. It resurfaced in alchemy and Rosicrucianism, occult philosophy, Romanticism's love for the Orient, and even in-depth psychology, as Jung rereads Zosimos and the Hermetica as symbolic maps of the psyche. The soul of Ficino's Hermetica still whispers in modern ideas of spiritual ascent, inner divinity, and cosmic unity, even if few remember the Florentine priest who first lit the lamp. Reflection, the translator as alchemist. In many ways, Ficino was an alchemist himself. He did not transmute metals, but languages. He did not work with fire, but with ink. He turned obscure Greek into shimmering Latin, and Latin into spiritual gold. He took a dusty scroll, long ignored, and turned it into a scripture. His translation was not accurate, but it was transformative. And that is the strange, quiet magic of scribes, scholars, and translators across history. They carry voices that are not theirs, and in doing so, give them new life. So when you read the Hermetica today, whether in a quiet passage on the divine mind, or a mystical line about the unity of all things, you are not only hearing the voice of ancient Alexandria. You are also hearing Marsilio Ficino, the priest who revived Thoth's voice in a Renaissance tongue. You are seated in a candlelit hall just outside Florence. It is All Souls' Day, 1469. The wind stirs the olive trees, and within the quiet walls of a Medici villa, a small group of men gather around a fire. They speak not of politics or art, but of the divine nature of the soul, the movements of the heavens, and the hidden truths in ancient words. The speaker tonight is Marsilio Ficino, and his theme, as always, is the harmony between Plato, Hermes Trismegistus, and Christ. This is no ordinary philosophical meeting. This is the spiritual heart of Renaissance, Florence's Neoplatonic revival, a movement born not only of texts and translations, but of ritual, community, and a yearning for unity in an increasingly fragmented world. In this section, we explore the intellectual and mystical environment that allowed Ficino's Hermetic vision to flourish, a space shaped by the Medici family, by Platonic devotion, and by the shared belief that divine truth could be reached not only through faith, but through philosophy, music, astrology, and love. The Medici and the patronage of the eternal. To understand the reach of Ficino's ideas, one must first understand the Medici. The Medici were more than bankers. They were cultural architects, shaping the intellectual landscape of 15th century Florence. In Cosimo de' Medici, Ficino found not only a patron but a spiritual father, a man who saw in ancient philosophy the tools for civilizing the soul. Cosimo's vision was simple, if ambitious: to create a new Athens in Florence, a Christian republic informed by Platonic values, where wisdom and beauty reflected divine order. This dream materialized in the formation of the Platonic Academy, an informal gathering of thinkers, artists, and priests, convened to discuss philosophy, cosmology, and theology. Ficino, at its center, gave voice to a philosophy that blurred the lines between pagan antiquity and Christian revelation. The Hermetica in this setting were not fringe curiosities. They were keys, part of a larger project to harmonize all wisdom traditions into a single, radiant truth. The Academy of Florence, a sanctuary for the soul. While the term academy evokes formal halls and robed professors, the Florentine Platonic Academy was more intimate, a circle of friends and correspondents bound by shared reverence for the ancients. Its members included Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, the precocious philosopher and linguist; Cristoforo Landino, commentator on Dante and Plato; Poliziano, humanist and scholar of Greek and Latin; and occasionally Lorenzo de' Medici himself, Cosimo's grandson and future ruler of Florence. They read Plato aloud, especially the Symposium, Timaeus, and Phaedrus, often accompanied by Ficino's own Latin translations and commentaries. They celebrated Plato's birthday with orations and feasts, and they considered Hermes Trismegistus not a mere curiosity, but a prophet philosopher, whose voice added gravitas to their sacred dialogues. To them, philosophy was not abstract argument, it was spiritual practice. Love, music, and the ascent of the soul. Ficino's philosophy was rooted in beauty, not superficial elegance, but ontological beauty, the radiance of the divine shining through creation. He saw music, art, and especially love as the ladders of ascent through which the soul could return to God. He wrote extensively on Platonic love, interpreting it as a force that draws the soul toward the eternal. For Ficino, love begins with the senses, with beauty perceived in the world. It then ascends through reason and contemplation, toward the form of beauty. Ultimately, it unites the soul with divine mind, echoing the Hermetic call to know thyself. This notion of ascent is central to both Platonism and the Hermetic corpus. In Poimandres, Hermes learns that man is made in the image of God, and that through purification and knowledge, he may return to divine unity. Ficino fused these traditions seamlessly. Astrology and the medicine of the stars. Ficino was also a physician, trained in the Galenic tradition, but he believed that health extended beyond the body. His view of medicine incorporated astrological timing, musical therapy, planetary sympathies, spiritual alignment. In his book De Vita Libri Tres, 3 Books on Life, 1489, he outlined a system for preserving the health of intellectuals and contemplatives. Drawing on Hermetic, Neoplatonic, and medieval sources, he taught how to balance the humors, harness the energies of planets, and align the soul with celestial harmonies. He even prescribed rituals and talismans, carefully designed objects infused with planetary influence to support spiritual and physical well-being. Though careful never to claim magical powers, Ficino walked a line between medicine and magic, philosophy and theurgy. Hermetic Christianity, reconciling pagan and Christian. One of Ficino's greatest contributions was his delicate weaving of Hermetic wisdom into Christian theology. He refused to view Hermes, Plato, and Christ as competitors. Instead, he proposed a continuum. Hermes revealed divine truths to the Egyptians. Pythagoras and Plato inherited and purified those truths. Christianity fulfilled and sanctified them. This vision, though controversial, allowed Renaissance thinkers to reclaim pagan texts as prefigurations of Christian revelation, echoes of a truth completed in Christ. Ficino wrote, "The Platonists and most of all Hermes discerned the divine things by reason. The Hebrews had them by prophecy. We Christians have them by both reason and revelation." This position gave him cover to explore ideas otherwise seen as dangerous. The divinity of the soul, the symbolism of nature, and the possibility of spiritual ascent without ecclesiastical mediation. Conflict and caution, walking the line. Despite his daring synthesis, Ficino was careful. He knew the Inquisition lurked just beyond the page. He emphasized that his philosophy was not magic, but natural theology. That the Hermetica were useful only when read through a Christian lens. That spiritual ascent required grace as well as reason. Still, his work inspired more radical thinkers, including Giovanni Pico, who would go on to propose that man was capable of shaping his own destiny through knowledge and ritual. Where Ficino was cautious, Pico was bold and paid for it with accusations of heresy and temporary arrest. The Hermetic echoes in art and culture. The spiritual philosophy of Ficino's Florence echoed beyond his study. In Botticelli's paintings, we see Platonic ideals rendered in human form. In Brunelleschi's architecture, we see cosmic harmony in stone. In Leonardo's notebooks, we glimpse the union of science, art, and mysticism. Even Michelangelo, in his letters, shows traces of Ficino's Platonic Christianity. These artists did not read the Corpus Hermeticum directly, but they breathed the air. Ficino purified a worldview that saw beauty, order, and soul in all things, a world where God is reflected in proportion, and where love elevates the spirit. Toward the close, the passing of the light. Ficino died in 1499, aged 66. His works would continue to circulate for decades, and his translations remained foundational well into the 17th century. Yet even before his death, the cultural tide was shifting. The Reformation was brewing. The Church was becoming more defensive, and new currents of thought, empirical, skeptical, and material, were emerging. Still, Ficino left behind a legacy of spiritual synthesis. He showed that ancient texts could be more than relics; they could be maps, tools, and mirrors. He did not discover Thoth's wisdom, but he believed in it deeply enough to let it transform his world. But what happened when others took Ficino's ideas further than he dared? How did the vision of Hermes Trismegistus, once veiled in Plato and baptized in Christian theology, become the seed of secret societies, magical systems, and revolutionary claims about human potential? The candles in Ficino's study had long since burned down. His body was laid to rest in 1499 at the Church of San Marco in Florence, but the ideas he helped reawaken, ideas born of Plato and Hermes, baptized in Christian mysticism, would not remain buried with him. Instead, they took root in new minds, bore strange fruit, and spread across Europe like the gentle glow of a lantern passed from hand to hand. What Ficino began as a project of harmony, blending classical wisdom with Christian faith, would, in the coming centuries, ignite new philosophies, secret brotherhoods, and esoteric revolutions. In this final section, we follow the thread of Ficino's Hermetic revival into its afterlife through the humanistic optimism of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, the mystical speculations of Giordano Bruno, and the cryptic proclamations of the Rosicrucians. Each believed in their own way that they were continuing the work of Thoth, uncovering divine truths lost to time, hidden behind symbols, or encoded in the stars. But the story would not remain safely philosophical. At the edge of Hermetic revival stood a dangerous question. What happens when the soul's ascent challenges the Church's authority on earth? Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, the daring synthesizer. If Ficino was the careful architect of spiritual harmony, Pico della Mirandola, 1463–1494, was its fiery champion. Brilliant, multilingual, and bold, Pico absorbed Ficino's teachings and took them further, blending Hermeticism, Platonism, Christian theology, Kabbalah, and Islamic philosophy into a grand system of universal truth. In 1486, at just 23 years old, Pico composed his famous 900 Theses, propositions drawn from all major wisdom traditions. Among them were bold claims about the divine dignity of man, the transformative power of magic, the existence of a primordial theology passed down from Hermes to Moses, to Plato to Christ. He intended to defend these theses in Rome, but the Church condemned several as heretical. His oration on the dignity of man, often called the Manifesto of the Renaissance, was not published in his lifetime. In it, Pico proclaims, "You, by your own free will, determine the limits of your nature. You may degenerate into the lower forms of life, or you may be reborn into the higher, the divine." This idea, rooted in both Hermetic assent and Neoplatonic freedom, shocked the guardians of orthodoxy. Pico died mysteriously just a few years later, perhaps poisoned. But his fusion of traditions, his belief in the mystical autonomy of the soul, would reverberate for centuries. Giordano Bruno, the infinite cosmos. If Ficino built a temple and Pico opened its doors, Giordano Bruno, 1548–1600, stepped inside and set it ablaze. Bruno, a former Dominican friar turned wandering philosopher, took the Hermetic worldview and launched it into cosmic speculation. He believed the universe is infinite and filled with worlds. God is present in all things not above creation, but within it. The soul has the capacity to rise through stages of illumination, reconnecting with its divine origin. Bruno read the Corpus Hermeticum as a manual for spiritual empowerment, echoing Ficino's ascent of the soul, but with revolutionary implications. To Bruno, the divine spark within man could not be confined by church dogma. He wrote openly of Hermes Trismegistus as a forgotten prophet of truth suppressed by religious authorities, but now rising again in secret. In his Spazio della Bestia Triunfante, he proposed a cosmic morality independent of ecclesiastical control, and in doing so, he signed his death warrant. Bruno was burned at the stake in Rome's Campo de' Fiori in 1600, condemned for heresy. His martyrdom would later be remembered by Enlightenment thinkers and occultists alike as the price of visionary thought. The Rosicrucian Manifestos, the return of hidden wisdom. In the early 17th century, anonymous texts began to circulate in German and Latin. Fama Fraternitatis, 1614. Confessio Fraternitatis, 1615. Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosencreuz, 1616. Together, they formed the Rosicrucian Manifesto's mysterious tracts proclaiming the existence of a secret brotherhood of sages, descended from ancient Egyptian, Hermetic, and Christian traditions. These texts claimed that a man named Christian Rosencreuz had traveled through the East, learned the hidden sciences, and returned to Europe to form a society dedicated to spiritual reform, alchemy, and universal knowledge. The Rosicrucians declared they possessed Hermetic and Kabbalistic wisdom. They worked in secret to guide the spiritual evolution of humanity. Their goal was not political, but inner transformation and divine illumination. No one knew if the brotherhood was real, but the texts touched a nerve in post-Reformation Europe, a continent torn by wars of religion and longing for spiritual renewal. Ficino's ideas, spiritual ascent, harmony of all traditions, sacred cosmology now reappeared in allegory and symbol, adapted into the codes of esoteric orders and occult systems. The decline in the echo. By the late 17th century, the tides were turning. Scientific rationalism rejected astrology and alchemy. Enlightenment thinkers mocked mysticism and magic. The church, weakened but still wary, discouraged Hermetic speculation. The Corpus Hermeticum fell from academic favor. Ficino's Neoplatonism was seen as a relic. Hermes Trismegistus was exposed by scholars like Isaac Casaubon as a product of late antiquity, not the primeval prophet the Renaissance believed him to be. And yet, the spirit of Ficino's Hermetic revival, the belief in a cosmos filled with meaning, in a soul that could ascend, in the value of ancient voices, did not disappear. It simply changed forms. The seed sown, modern legacies. The Hermetic current would flow quietly through the Romantic era, resurface in the Theosophical Society of the 19th century, and inspire modern systems of Western esotericism. The Golden Dawn. Anthroposophy. Jungian psychology. New Age spirituality. In many of these, Ficino is not cited but his spirit is felt. Even in today's fascination with astrology, spiritual healing, sacred geometry, and the idea that ancient Egypt held hidden truths, we hear the echo of Ficino's translation lamp, burning still. Final reflection, the voice that returned. What in the end did Marsilio Ficino awaken? He did not create Hermeticism, but he revived it not as a historical artifact, but as a living worldview. In translating the Corpus Hermeticum, he brought forth a voice that had been silent for centuries. But that voice, the voice of Thoth, of Hermes, did not say what we think it said. Its true meaning was blurred, filtered through Renaissance longing, Christian theology, and Platonic idealism. And yet, even in misinterpretation, it carried power. Ficino's vision offered an alternative way of being one where the soul is divine, the universe is ordered, beauty is a reflection of truth, and wisdom is something you remember, not merely learn. It is a quiet vision, not revolutionary, but in times of noise and chaos, it whispers still in art, in thought, in silence. So when you see the stars at night and feel a strange connection, or when music moves you in ways that defy logic, or when an ancient phrase seems to speak directly to your soul, know that you are hearing, faintly, the same voice that spoke to Ficino. A voice he thought belonged to Thoth. A voice we still do not fully understand, but a voice that somehow endures. Story 6. The Secret Scribes of Arab Hermeticism, translating Thoth in Baghdad. Imagine the bustling city of Baghdad in the 9th century CE, a city unlike any other, with canals flowing through its center, lanterns glowing in study halls, and libraries filled with scrolls in Arabic, Syriac, Greek, and Persian. At the heart of this intellectual world stood a remarkable institution, Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. It was here, beneath the dome of a caliph's ambition, that the ancient voice of Thoth, now cloaked in the name of Hermes Trismegistus, was translated, interpreted, and transformed yet again. But this time, it would not be the Christianized Hermes of Renaissance Florence, nor the mystical sage of Hellenistic Alexandria. In the Abbasid context, Hermes was reborn as a prophet, a philosopher, and even a bridge between Islam and ancient pagan knowledge. This section explores how Hermeticism entered the Islamic world, how it was received, and how Arabic translators, particularly in Baghdad, helped shape the alchemy, astronomy, and cosmology of the medieval Islamic Golden Age. The House of Wisdom, Baghdad's beacon of knowledge. Founded during the reign of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, r. 786–809, and flourishing under his son al-Mamun, r. 813–833, the Beit al-Hikmah was more than a library. It was a translation institute, a center for scientific dialogue, and a symbol of the Abbasid commitment to learning. Under al-Mamun's sponsorship, scholars were commissioned to seek out texts from Byzantine territories, especially those written in Greek. These included the works of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Euclid, and crucially, Hermes Trismegistus. In this environment, the Hermetic writings, often dismissed or misunderstood in the West, were welcomed into Arabic culture through a different lens, not as foreign paganism, but as part of a primordial wisdom tradition compatible with Islamic thought. Hermes in Islamic tradition, from god to prophet. Islamic scholars did not view Hermes simply as a philosopher. They connected him to a chain of prophets stretching from Adam to Mohammed, often identifying him with the Quranic figure Idris, commonly associated with Enoch. This identification transformed Hermes from a mystical Hellenistic figure into a divinely inspired prophet who built the first cities after the flood, taught humans writing, astrology, and medicine, received revelations from God, ascended to the heavens like Enoch or Jesus. Several Islamic sources, especially those from Ismaili and Sufi traditions, refer to three Hermeses. The first Hermes, an ancient prophet from Egypt often identified with Thoth. The second Hermes, who lived in Babylon and revived sciences after the flood. The third Hermes, who lived in Egypt again and wrote philosophical and medical treatises. This typology allowed Islamic scholars to respect Hermetic wisdom without compromising monotheism. The Hermetica, though composed in pagan contexts, were now understood as part of the primordial truth, a sacred science passed down through divine intermediaries. The Arabic Hermetica, translations and adaptations. Though the Corpus Hermeticum itself was not translated wholesale into Arabic. Many Hermetic ideas survived in Arabic texts, especially those on alchemy, astrology, and cosmology. Key texts attributed to Hermes or Hermetic figures include the Kitab al-Ilal, Book of Causes, attributed to Hermes. It deals with natural philosophy and metaphysics. The Sur al-Khalika, Secret of Creation, often attributed to Balinas Apollonius of Tyana. This pseudo-Hermetic work draws on Hermetic cosmology, describing the universe in symbolic terms. Various treatises on alchemy, sometimes attributed directly to Idris/Hermes or to his disciples. Arabic translations did not merely preserve Greek ideas. They reinterpreted them through Islamic frameworks, embedding Hermetic thought into discussions of the soul and afterlife, the structure of the cosmos, the relationship between God, man, and nature. Hermetic alchemy, from metallurgy to metaphysics. Perhaps the most enduring contribution of Hermeticism in the Islamic world came through alchemy or alchemia. Unlike later European notions of turning lead into gold, Islamic alchemy was as much about spiritual transformation as material change. Drawing from Hermetic symbolism, alchemists believed that matter was alive and reflected cosmic principles. Transformation required knowledge of both nature and the self. The philosopher's stone symbolized the perfected soul. Alchemical thinkers like Jabir ibn Hayyan Jeber and al-Razi wrote extensively, combining Greek philosophy, Indian numerology, and Islamic theology. Though not all were explicitly Hermetic, many drew from Hermetic cosmologies, especially in their view that, as above so below, the macrocosm, universe, mirrors the microcosm, human being. This central Hermetic tenet found a home in Islamic esotericism, particularly among Sufi mystics who saw the human heart as a mirror of the cosmos. Secrecy and symbolism, why the Hermetica were hidden. Unlike the public acclaim given to Aristotle or Galen, Hermetic writings were often restricted to elite circles. Their association with magic, astrology, and hidden sciences made them both powerful and suspect. Hermetic books in Arabic often included warnings that the knowledge within should only be used by the wise, and that misuse would lead to ruin. Some texts were written in riddles or symbolic language, with layers of interpretation required to unlock their meanings. These were not errors in translation, but deliberate protective devices. Knowledge, especially sacred or dangerous knowledge, was not meant for the masses. Only the initiated, those with spiritual maturity, could understand it. This practice reflects the original Hermetic ethos, seen in the Corpus Hermeticum. This discourse, my son, you must not give to the many, but only to those whom God has deemed worthy. The Hermetic spirit in Arabic was, then, a secret science passed quietly between sages, preserved not for immediate utility, but for eternal insight. Cultural symbiosis, Greece, Egypt, and Islam. What made the Islamic adoption of Hermeticism so remarkable was its ability to embrace contradiction. Pagan sources were reimagined as prophetic messages. Greek logic was harmonized with Quranic cosmology. Egyptian myth was recast as universal allegory. In doing so, Islamic scholars didn't dilute Hermeticism. They revitalized it. They treated Hermes not as a forgotten relic of paganism, but as a wise ancestor, someone who glimpsed divine unity before the coming of Islam. This allowed Islamic civilization to become, for several centuries, the custodian of Hermetic thought, preserving and refining it while Europe plunged into scholastic rigidity. Unresolved curiosity, what was lost in translation. And yet, with all this flourishing, much of the original Hellenistic richness of the Corpus Hermeticum was altered or lost in the Arabic context. What nuances of meaning were changed when pagan mysticism became prophetic monotheism? What metaphors were misunderstood or recast through Islamic theology? Did the translators preserve Thoth's true voice, or did they make it say something new? These questions linger as we consider the next phase in Hermeticism's journey, its return to Europe, not through Greek monks, but through Arabic texts translated into Latin during the 12th century in Spain and Sicily. This backflow Hermetica translated from Greek into Arabic, and from Arabic back into Latin, created a strange mirror effect. Western thinkers in the Middle Ages would often encounter Hermetic ideas secondhand, unaware that their origin was not Arabic or Islamic, but Hellenistic Egyptian. As we shall see, this dual lineage would give rise to new confusions, new syntheses, and new misreadings. The lamps in Baghdad flickered softly as manuscripts were passed hand to hand, copied carefully by trained scribes, their margins filled with diagrams, mystical symbols, and tiny notes in Arabic script. These texts, born of Greek and Egyptian wisdom and reshaped by Islamic thought, would not remain confined within the Abbasid world. As centuries passed, they began a journey westward across deserts, over mountains, through Andalusian libraries, and into the monasteries and scriptoria of medieval Europe. But the voice they carried was no longer solely that of Hermes, nor Thoth, nor even the early Arab philosophers. It had become something more complex, a layered voice, bearing centuries of commentary, spiritual revision, and linguistic translation. In this section, we trace the development of Hermeticism within the Islamic world, from early thinkers like Jabir ibn Hayyan, through the hidden schools of thought that shaped mystical Islam, and finally toward the translation movement in Al-Andalus and Latin Europe. Through this journey, we uncover how Hermes the prophet, as imagined in Arabic, became the misunderstood but deeply influential figure at the heart of European occultism. Jabir ibn Hayyan Jebr, the alchemist of the caliphs. In the shadow of the Abbasid court, a man known as Jabir ibn Hayyan, c. 721-815 CE, emerged as one of the most prolific and mysterious alchemists in Islamic history. Sometimes known in the Latin West as Jebr, Jabir's legacy spans hundreds of treatises, though scholars debate how many he personally authored. Jabir's work represents a synthesis of Hermetic principles, ascribed to Hermes Trismegistus; Greek natural philosophy, especially Aristotle; Islamic theology, particularly Shiite cosmology; Persian numerology and mysticism. Jabir wrote that every material substance contained both a spiritual essence and a hidden correspondence to the cosmos. Alchemy, then, was not simply the art of making gold, it was the science of purification, of both matter and soul. In his thought, Hermes was not just a philosopher. He was the first master of the divine craft, and his teachings formed part of a sacred lineage, passed through prophets and wise men, including, in Jabir's schema, Ali, cousin of the prophet Mohammed, the Ismaili and Sufi Hermetist. As Islamic thought evolved, Hermetic ideas found new homes within esoteric sects, particularly among the Ismailis and Sufi mystics. The Ismailis, a Shiite sect with a deep reverence for hidden knowledge, B.A. Macron letter 1E6DIN, integrated Hermetic cosmology into their own hierarchical vision of the universe. For them, the divine manifests through a chain of emanations, not unlike Neoplatonic or Hermetic frameworks. Knowledge is passed through initiates, with prophets and imams acting as gatekeepers to truth. The figure of Hermes served as a symbol of this primordial knowledge, hidden but accessible to the spiritually awakened. Meanwhile, in Sufi circles, Hermes became an archetype of the perfect man, Al-Insan al-Kamil, a figure who, through spiritual discipline and divine love, returns to unity with the One. In both traditions, Hermeticism was not foreign or threatening, it was subsumed, refined, and localized. Its cosmology complemented Quranic revelation. Its esotericism paralleled Islamic spiritual hierarchies. Its alchemy was a metaphor for inner transformation. From Arabic to Latin, the translation movement. By the 12th century, a major shift began. Across Muslim-Christian contact zones, especially Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, and Sicily, Latin-speaking scholars encountered the Arabic Hermetica for the first time. Driven by curiosity, religious ambition, and the practical desire for medical and astronomical knowledge, European